The night they almost let a Navy SEAL die on a gurney, Emily Carter was already moving. She had heard the argument from the hallway, three doctors debating protocol, while a man's lung folded in on itself. She pushed through the door with the needle in her hand and a look that stopped conversation cold. The ER chief told her to step back. She didn't. The man on the gurney reached up, fingers wrapping her wrist like a vice, and what came out of his mouth wasn't a thank you or a plea. It was two words, rough, certain, almost disbelieving. "You're Wraith." Nobody in that room understood what it meant. Emily did. And the life she had spent 2 years carefully dismantling cracked open right there under the fluorescent lights of Harlow County General. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, this is the kind of channel where no one gets out clean and no one gets forgotten. Hit subscribe right now, because the stories we tell don't wait for you to catch up. Drop a like while you're at it, and leave a comment with your city and your country. I want to know how far this story has already traveled. People watching from places I've never even searched on a map. Let's see where you are. Now, back to Emily. The shift had started badly, which wasn't unusual. Emily Carter arrived at Harlow County General at 6:43 in the morning, 15 minutes before her clock-in, because she had learned in her first week here that arriving on time meant walking directly into someone else's unmanaged disaster. She moved through the ambulance bay in worn sneakers with a hole beginning at the left toe that she kept meaning to deal with, badge clipped to her scrub top, hair pulled back in the no-nonsense way of someone who had stopped thinking about hair a long time ago. The overnight charge nurse, a compact woman named Patrice Alderman, who had been running nights at Harlow County for 11 years, handed her a clipboard without making eye contact. 3 in the trauma hall, 2 more incoming from the interstate pileup. And Dr. Calloway is already in one of his moods. "When isn't he?" Emily said. Patrice finally looked up. She had the kind of face that had once been expressive and had been worn flat by years of institutional frustration. "He made the new resident cry. The short one." "A Falabi?" "No, the other short one, transferred in from Whitmore last month." Emily took the clipboard. "He'll be fine." "She," Patrice said. Emily said nothing and walked into the department. Harlow County General occupied a gray concrete building on the eastern edge of Kelton, a mid-sized city that existed in that particular American category of places, large enough to have a trauma center, small enough that everyone eventually knew everyone else's business. The hospital had been built in the early 80s with federal money and had been renovated twice since then without ever quite losing the institutional heaviness of its original construction. The trauma wing smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something older and harder to name, the accumulated residue of crisis. Emily had worked here for 2 years and she had stopped trying to identify the smell. She started rounds at 6:55. Bed 4 was a 38-year-old construction worker named Dale with a dislocated shoulder who was refusing pain medication on principle, a principle Emily suspected had something to do with his insurance situation and nothing to do with actual stoicism, because his jaw was clenched in a way that suggested significant pain. She talked him through it calmly, got him to accept a lower dose option, and moved on. Bed 7 was an elderly woman, 71, named Constance Beaumont, who had come in with what triage had labeled as non-specific chest discomfort and downgraded to a priority 3. Emily stood at her bedside for 3 minutes longer than the chart required. Something about the woman's breathing pattern, the slight laboring on exhale, the way she kept her left hand pressed flat against her sternum without seeming to realize she was doing it, didn't line up with the priority 3 assessment. Emily listened to her lungs. She looked at the initial EKG strip clipped to the chart. She looked at the woman's face. "Has the pain been coming and going?" Emily asked. "Or has it been steady since this morning?" Constance Beaumont looked at her with the cautious gratitude of someone who wasn't accustomed to being asked follow-up questions. "It comes and goes," she said, "but it's been worse since about 4. I kept thinking it would pass." Emily ordered an updated EKG. She didn't ask anyone's permission because she didn't technically need it for a diagnostic flag. She'd learned the exact wording of the hospital's nursing protocol on that point in her 3rd week, after Calloway had tried to dress her down the first time for stepping outside what he considered her lane. She flagged it for Dr. Osei to co-sign and moved on. Dr. Vance Calloway found her at the nursing station 8 minutes later. He was 46, lean in the way of someone who exercised with the same joyless discipline he applied to everything else, with a face that had probably been considered handsome 10 years ago and now had a sharpened quality to it, something that had been worn down to its most efficient and least pleasant form. He had been ER chief at Harlow County for 3 years. In that time, he had published 2 papers in regional journals, reorganized the department's triage protocol twice, and developed a specific and focused animosity toward Emily Carter that had never been explained directly and didn't need to be. Some things explained themselves. "You ordered a diagnostic on Beaumont," he said. Not a question. The tone of a man who had already decided the answer was wrong. "Updated EKG. I flagged something on her initial rhythm strip and her breathing pattern doesn't..." Her priority was assessed by triage. Triage had a 6-patient queue, and she came in at the same time as the accident cases from Route 7. The initial strip was read fast. Emily kept her voice even. "It takes 4 minutes to run a repeat EKG, Dr. Calloway." "You're a nurse, Carter." There it was, those 4 words with the whole architecture behind them, the specific arrangement of syllables that was meant to function as a ceiling. Know what you are. Know where you stop. "You are not a diagnostician. I flagged it for Dr. Osei to review. That's within protocol." "I don't need you to cite protocol to me." Emily held his gaze for a moment. "No, you don't." She went back to her rounds. 17 minutes later, Dr. Osei co-signed the EKG order from his phone. The results showed early-stage NSTEMI, a heart attack that had been developing quietly while Constance Beaumont sat in a priority 3 bed, waiting for someone to look twice. Within the hour, she was being transferred to the cardiac unit upstairs. Calloway was in the physician workroom when it happened. He didn't come out. Emily drank half a cup of coffee, threw the rest away because it had gone cold, and kept working. This was the particular rhythm of her days at Harlow County General, and she had made a kind of accommodation with it. Not peace, that wasn't quite the right word, but a functional understanding of what this place was and what her role in it was, and what the boundaries of that role would cost her if she pushed against them too hard or too visibly. She had built the invisibility deliberately, the quiet competence, the de-escalated presence, the habit of being right without making noise about being right. She had constructed it piece by piece over 2 years like a structure she needed to live inside. What she had been before she came to Harlow County was not something she discussed. Not with Patrice, who she liked. Not with Dr. Osei, who was decent, and occasionally looked at her like he suspected there was more to her than the chart suggested. Not with anyone. She had filed the paperwork for the civilian nursing license, accepted the position in the ER, moved into a rented house on the east side of Kelton with no furniture she cared about and a lease she hadn't committed to renewing, and begun the work of becoming someone who had no history worth mentioning. It had been going reasonably well, by her own quiet accounting, until now. She took her lunch break at 12:30, which was the first gap in the morning's intake flow. The break room had a television mounted in the corner, sound turned low, local news channel running footage of something that had happened north of Kelton. A reporter standing at the tree line off Route 9, gesturing at something out of frame, the particular body language of someone filling time while they waited for official information that wasn't coming yet. Emily watched for a moment without really watching. She ate her sandwich, turkey, no mustard, made at 5 in the morning with the focused efficiency that she applied to most logistical tasks. She was thinking about Constance Beaumont's EKG, not because there was anything more to do about it, but because she had a habit, which she had never been able to fully break, of running cases back through her memory looking for the things she might have missed. Her phone buzzed. "Patrice, get back down here now. Multiple casualties incoming. Major GSW. ETA 6 minutes. She was standing up before she finished reading. She heard it before she reached the trauma bay. The specific organized chaos of a critical incoming. The sound of a team that had shifted gears, voices calibrated to urgency without panic, wheels on tile. She pushed through the doors and took in the scene with the kind of instant rapid assessment she had spent years training into herself, and considerably more time since then trying to suppress, to keep locked somewhere behind her eyes where it didn't show. The man on the gurney was big, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke to specific physical training rather than size for its own sake. He was wearing civilian clothes, Dark shirt that had been cut open at the chest, cargo pants, one boot still on, the other removed or cut away at the seam. There was blood. Significant blood, soaked through a field compress that had been applied before the ambulance arrived. A compress that someone had pressed hard and held for a long time. The wound was right side of the chest, high. The paramedic was giving report in the compressed, efficient way of someone who had done it 1,000 times. GSW to the right chest, single entry, no confirmed exit. Found him on the shoulder of Route 9 northbound. Witness flagged it. Patient was conscious at scene and talking. Deteriorated in the rig. BP was 90/60 on scene, dropped to 82 on transport. 2 large-bore IVs established in the field. Dr. Ose was already gloved. How long? 24 minutes from scene call. Emily moved to the left side of the gurney and began attaching cardiac leads with the practiced speed of someone for whom this motion was entirely automatic, hands moving without requiring instruction from conscious thought. She was watching his chest as she worked. The right side wasn't rising the way it should. The left side was compensating, working slightly too hard. She looked at his neck. The veins were beginning to distend, not dramatically, not yet, but the trajectory was clear. And his trachea, when she looked carefully, was beginning to deviate, not far, but measurably, to the left. She had seen this before. She had seen it in places that did not have the luxury of SAT monitors or properly lit rooms or the option of extended observation. Tension pneumo, she said. Quiet. Flat. Not a question. Ose looked up from where he was checking the IV lines. What? His right lung is collapsing. Tracheal deviation is starting. JVD is developing. Right side isn't moving. She was already looking at the instrument tray, already knowing what needed to be on it. He needs needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. Now. His oxygen SAT is still reading. His SAT is about to fall off a cliff. By the time the monitor shows us the number we're worried about, we've already lost 90 seconds. She found the 14-gauge needle she'd mentally cataloged when she walked in. I've watched this progression 3 times. It moves faster than people expect. Dr. Vance Calloway walked into the trauma bay. He had a specific way of entering a room, not loudly, not with obvious theater, but with the settled certainty of a man who believed that his presence recalibrated whatever was happening. He looked at the patient. He looked at the monitors. He looked at Emily, who was standing at the right side of the gurney with a 14-gauge needle in her hand, and his expression did the thing it always did. Closed, organized, certain. Carter, step back. Doctor, Calloway, this patient has a developing tension pneumothorax. This patient is being managed by 2 attending physicians, and you are a floor nurse who is holding an instrument she has no authorization to use. Step back. The room did what rooms did when Calloway spoke that way. It went quiet. Dr. Ose looked at his hands. The resident, Afalabi, the one who had survived her 6 weeks on rotation by learning to read the political weather of this department with considerable accuracy, pressed herself toward the wall. The other nurses found things to look at. Emily looked at the patient. His eyes had been closed. They weren't now. He was looking at her. Not at Calloway, not at Ose. Directly at her, with a focus that had no business existing in a man who had lost the blood he'd lost and was running on the oxygen his compromised lung could still provide. His right hand came up, barely, 2 or 3 inches off the gurney rail, and his fingers found her wrist. The grip was weak. It was deliberate. His lips moved. She leaned in. Why, he said, rough, barely there, each word costing him something. Is a combat operator working in an ER? Nobody in the room moved. The question hung in the antiseptic air of the trauma bay, like something that had changed the atmospheric pressure. Emily felt it. The shift. The way every person in that room had heard something they didn't have a framework for, something that didn't fit the story they had about who she was and what she was doing here. She felt it, and she made a decision, the same kind of decision she had made in other rooms in other circumstances. The kind that happens below the level of deliberation because there isn't time for deliberation. She looked at Calloway. I'm going to decompress his chest, she said. Not asking, not requesting, stating. If you touch that patient with that needle, I will have you physically removed from, then remove me afterward. She was already positioning. Left hand finding the landmark, second rib, mid-clavicular line, right side. with the certainty of someone for whom this wasn't a procedure learned in a classroom. Right now, his trachea is deviating and his cardiovascular system is about to compensate in a way none of us are going to like. Osei looked at the patient. He looked at the trachea. He looked at Emily's hands, which were not shaking, which had not shaken, which showed no sign of shaking. He stepped aside. Emily advanced the needle. The rush of air was immediate, that unmistakable hiss of a chest cavity under pressure finding release, the sound of decompression working the way it was supposed to work. The SAT monitor, which had been trending down in the background, stopped, held at 89% for a long moment that felt longer than it was. Then it began to climb. 91, 94. The patient's left lung stopped its frantic compensating. His color, which had been acquiring a grayish undertone that Emily had been tracking since she walked in, began to shift back towards something livable. He exhaled. His hand, which had still been loosely around her wrist, released. "Chest tube setup," Emily said, and this time no one in the room questioned it. His name was Captain Marcus Holt. The ID in his cargo pants pocket said Navy, no unit specified, which was itself a kind of specification. The name meant nothing to anyone in the trauma bay, not to Calloway, who had retreated to the edge of the room and was watching with an expression Emily recognized as someone reorganizing for a later engagement, not to Osei, who was focused entirely on the chest tube procedure, not to anyone else. It meant something to Emily. She kept her face still and her hands moving and let the meaning of it sit somewhere quiet inside her where no one could see it. She stayed through the chest tube placement and the repeat imaging and the first 40 minutes of stabilization, which was longer than her assignment technically required. Nobody asked her to leave. Calloway had gone somewhere during the chest tube, she wasn't sure where. And without him in the room, the atmosphere was simply a trauma team doing its work, which was the atmosphere she had always preferred. She monitored, she adjusted. She watched Marcus Holt's numbers do what they were supposed to do when you caught a tension pneumothorax before it finished what it was trying to do. When he was stable enough to transfer, she checked his chart one final time at the nursing station. Emergency contacts. One number, initials only, no full name. Below that, the paramedic's notation. Active duty, Navy. Unit not specified. Below that, added by someone at intake. No family contact established. She closed the chart. The afternoon moved the way afternoons in the ER always moved. The next patient arriving before the previous one's paperwork was finished, the department's rhythm indifferent to the weight of what had just happened. Emily triaged a teenager with a forearm fracture. She checked on Dale in bed 4, who had finally accepted the pain medication and was sleeping with his mouth slightly open. She answered 12 minutes of questions from the new resident, the transferred one, not Afalabi, who had apparently decided Emily was the person most likely to give her a straight answer about departmental politics, which was both perceptive and somewhat burdensome. At 3:15, Calloway appeared beside her in the medication room. He had prepared what he wanted to say. She could tell by the rhythm of it, the measured delivery of someone who had chosen their words in advance and was now executing the script. He told her that her behavior in the trauma bay constituted insubordination, that performing an intervention without attending physician authorization was a protocol violation regardless of outcome, and that he was initiating a formal incident report that would be filed with the nursing director and the department chief of medicine. Emily finished counting the medication she was counting. "I understand," she said. "I want to be clear. This isn't personal. I understand." If the patient had experienced any complication from an unauthorized, he would have died. She said it without heat, without emphasis, the way you state something that is simply true. Not from a complication. In approximately 3 to 4 minutes, he would have been in cardiac arrest from obstructive shock, and the intervention would have been CPR instead of decompression. I've seen this presentation resolve in that time frame, Dr. Calloway, more than once, not in a building with monitors and equipment, in a field with what was available. A pause. "That's not relevant to—" "I know," Emily said. "File the report." She left the medication room before he could respond. She walked to the end of the hallway and stood at the window that looked out over the hospital's east parking structure and breathed for a moment, slowly, the way she had been taught to breathe in situations that required steadiness she didn't necessarily feel. The incident report was a problem. Not an insurmountable one, probably, but a problem. It was exactly the kind of documented attention she had spent 2 years avoiding. She went back to work. She was home by 8. The house on the east side of Kelton was small and clean and almost entirely impersonal. Furniture from a secondhand store downtown, no photographs on the walls, no decorative objects that meant anything. She had done this deliberately. She ate soup that went lukewarm because she kept forgetting to address it, her attention drifting in the direction of the television she had on for background noise but wasn't watching. The local news was running something about Route 9 again. The same reporter, different footage, a state police vehicle visible in the background now, lights off. Whatever had happened up there, it was being managed carefully. Her phone rang at 9:51. Unknown number, local area code. She almost let it go. She answered it. "Ms. Carter." A woman's voice. Neutral, efficient, the tone of someone who had been trained to give away exactly as much as was necessary and no more. "This is Lieutenant Commander Adele Novak. I'm sorry for the late hour. I'm calling about a patient admitted to Harlow County General this afternoon. Marcus Holt." Emily set down her spoon. "I'm off shift." "I'm aware. I'm not calling about his medical care." A pause that had precision to it. "He's been asking for you specifically. He's been fairly insistent. The ICU staff told him you were the nurse who performed the initial intervention." Another pause. "He asked me to tell you that Kestrel sends his regards." Emily was quiet. The soup cooled another degree. Outside, the street was entirely ordinary. A neighbor's dog barking once, a car passing, the specific nighttime quiet of a residential block in a medium-sized American city. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. She drove with the windows down despite the temperature because she needed the cold air and she needed to think. And thinking had always worked better for her when something physical was engaged at the same time. The feel of the steering wheel, the particular darkness of Kelton's streets at this hour, the cold on her face and forearms. Kestrel. She had not heard that word in 2 years. She had not expected to hear it again. It belonged to a version of her life that she had filed away behind a door she had been careful to leave closed. Not because she had forgotten what was behind it, because nothing from that period of her life was forgettable, but because the act of not opening it was something she had chosen deliberately and maintained with the same discipline she applied to everything else. She badged in through the staff entrance, took the elevator to the 4th floor. The ICU at this hour was the quietest part of the hospital. Monitors running their steady mechanical commentary, night nurses moving through their checks with the unhurried efficiency of people who had learned to conserve energy across a 12-hour shift. Outside room 412, a man in plain clothes stood with his back against the wall in a posture that most people would have read as casual. Emily read it as something considerably more intentional and gave him a nod that he returned without expression before stepping aside. Marcus Holt was elevated slightly in the bed, chest tube still in place, lines running their various necessary work. His color was better. His face, now that she could see it without the emergency overlaid on everything, was familiar in the particular way that faces become familiar when you have shared circumstances that most people never encounter. Not the familiarity of friendship, not warmth exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who had once seen you do something that most people don't know you can do. "You cut your hair," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation. "You got shot," Emily said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. It apparently hurt too much to complete. "Yeah, that happened." She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat. She wasn't going to stand for this conversation. Whatever this conversation was, she wasn't going to stand for it. "How bad is the rest?" "I've had worse." "That's not what I asked." A pause. 2 additional wounds. 1 vest stopped. 1 went through the left side, soft tissue, clean exit. Cracked 2 ribs on the right from the vest impact. He shifted slightly, and the shift cost him something visible. "The chest was the problem." "The chest was the problem because you didn't get to a facility fast enough." "I was occupied." "With what?" He looked at the door. He looked at her. Something in his assessment resolved itself. "There's a property," he said, "approximately 40 miles north of Kelton, back roads off Route 9. You'd spend a month looking at satellite imagery and miss it if you didn't know exactly what you were looking at." He paused. "I knew what I was looking at." "What kind of property?" "The kind that isn't registered with any county authority. the kind running significant traffic at hours that don't correspond to any legitimate operation. The kind with perimeter security that a civilian location has no business having. He looked at her steadily. I have 7 months of documentation, photographs, transaction records, communication intercepts, all of it sitting on an encrypted drive that I was in the process of delivering to a federal contact when someone decided that wasn't going to happen. Emily absorbed this. She looked at his face, at the monitors, at the chest tube doing its necessary work. How long before the people who shot you figure out where you are? They know I was transported. They'll narrow it to Harlow County within the next several hours if they haven't already. His eyes were steady on hers. The window for moving that documentation is short. What do you need from me? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but the precision in it had changed, become something more direct. Right now, nothing actionable. I needed to know you were real. I needed to know the person who walked into that trauma bay was who I thought she was. He paused. I was in Vertal sector when we got word that Wraith had been killed in action. I didn't believe the report then. Emily said nothing. I believe it less now, he said, after watching what you did to my chest with a 14-gauge needle and no attending physician authorization. She stood. She looked at him for a long moment. This man in this bed, with everything he was carrying and everything that was coming toward this hospital, now that his location was going to become known. She checked his drip. She looked at the chest tube drainage. She noted his respiratory rate on the monitor, which was where it should be, which was something. Get some sleep, she said. Carter, whatever is on that drive, she said, turning toward the door. It needs to be somewhere other than where it is right now, before morning. She walked out of the room. The man in the hallway watched her go. She pressed the elevator button and stood in the corridor while the car came up from the floors below, and her hands, which had been steady all day, through Constance Beaumont's EKG and Calloway's confrontation and the needle in Marcus Holt's chest and everything else. Finally, in this empty hallway with no one to perform steadiness for, were not entirely steady. She watched them for a moment. The elevator opened. She stepped in and the doors closed behind her, and somewhere north of Kelton, she knew with the specific certainty of someone who had spent years understanding how these things moved, someone was already calculating the distance between Route 9 and Harlow County General, and they were not going to wait until morning to close it. The drive home the second time took 11 minutes because she pushed it, and she spent 8 of those 11 minutes running the math on what she knew and what she didn't, and what the gap between those two things was likely to cost. What she knew. Marcus Holt was a Navy captain with 7 months of documentation on an illegal operation 40 miles north of Kelton. Someone had tried to kill him to prevent that documentation from reaching federal hands. And whoever that someone was had the resources and the training to track a wounded man across a county with reasonable efficiency. What she didn't know was how much time she actually had before the radius of their search collapsed around Harlow County General, and not knowing that made every other calculation provisional. She got home at 10:47. She did not go to sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen that was running low on ink, and she wrote out the operational shape of the problem, the way she had been taught to write out problems. Not the emotional content of it, not what it meant for the 2 years of careful quiet she had built here, but the logistics. Who had access to ambulance dispatch records? How long it would take someone with the right contacts to cross-reference Route 9 call logs with Harlow County General's intake. Whether the man in plain clothes outside room 412 was Holt's only security, or whether there were others she hadn't seen. Whether Holt's encrypted drive was physically with him, which would be reckless, but also the kind of thing you did when you were running out of time and options. At 1 in the morning, she made coffee she didn't need and drank half of it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the empty street. And she thought about Calloway's incident report. And she thought about Constance Beaumont's EKG, and she thought about how completely unremarkable this house looked from the outside, how thoroughly it matched every other house on this block, how much work she had put into being unremarkable, and how none of that work had survived a single shift. She went to bed at 2. She set her alarm for 5:30. She slept approximately 4 hours, which was more than she'd slept in worse situations, and woke up already thinking. She arrived at Harlow County General at 6:50, which was earlier than usual even for her. Patrice was still on the tail end of nights, processing paperwork at the nursing station with the zombified focus of someone in hour 11 of 12. She looked up when Emily badged through. "You look terrible," Patrice said. "I feel fine." "You look like you slept in your car." "I slept in my bed for 4 hours. I'm fine." Emily dropped her bag behind the station and picked up the overnight census. "Anything I need to know?" "ICU had a quiet night. Your GSW from yesterday is stable. They're saying he might be strong enough to move off the vent this afternoon." Patrice paused. "He asked about you again. 3 in the morning, he asked the night nurse if Emily Carter was on shift." Emily kept her eyes on the census sheet. "And," Patrice said, with the particular tone of someone who has decided to deliver news they've been holding, "Calloway's incident report went to Director Hassan's desk last night. Apparently he hand-delivered it before he left instead of routing it through the system." Emily looked up. "Hand-delivered," she said. "That's what Kira told me. She was at the administrative desk when he brought it in." Patrice watched her face with the careful attention of someone who cared about the answer. "How bad is it?" "I don't know yet," Emily said, which was honest. She picked up her assignment sheet. "What's in the trauma hall?" Patrice let her change the subject, which was one of the things Emily valued about her. 2 overnights still waiting on labs. And there's a walk-in in bed 2, 63-year-old male with abdominal pain. Been there since 4. Nobody's gotten to him properly yet. Emily went to bed 2. The man in bed 2 was named Walter Greer, and he had the specific combination of symptoms, location, character of the pain, accompanying nausea, the way he kept shifting position without finding relief, that Emily clocked inside 90 seconds as potentially consistent with a perforated ulcer. She got his history. She noted the aspirin use, daily, high dose, because his cardiologist had recommended it, and he had decided that more was probably better. She ordered blood work and imaging and flagged it, this time for Dr. Osei explicitly, with a clinical note that was specific enough that no one could reasonably claim she was practicing outside her scope. She was finishing the flag when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text, from the same unknown number that had called her last night. Change in situation. Need to see you. N.N. Novak. The lieutenant commander. Emily read the text twice and then walked to the break room and replied, "On shift until 7 p.m. What changed?" The response came back in under a minute. His room was accessed last night. Someone with staff credentials. 0340. ICU security has footage, but the face was obscured. We're moving him. Emily stood very still in the break room, holding her phone, and looked at the wall-mounted clock above the coffee maker. 6:58 in the morning. Someone had been inside Marcus Holt's room at 3:40 in the morning with staff credentials that were either legitimate or good enough to pass the ICU's access system, and she was standing in the same building. She typed, "Is he safe? For now. Moving in 2 hours." She put her phone in her pocket and went back to work because there was nothing else immediately she could do, and because Walter Greer in bed 2 was still waiting on his imaging results, and his abdominal pain had not stopped being a problem just because hers had gotten more complicated. The imaging on Walter Greer confirmed what she'd suspected. Dr. Osei reviewed it at 7:40 and looked at Emily's clinical note, and then looked at her with the expression he occasionally had, the one that sat somewhere between impressed and mildly troubled, as if he was working out what to do with a resource he didn't quite know how to categorize. "This is a good catch," he said. "He's been here since 4 in the morning." "I know. I'm saying you caught it." "I know what you're saying." She handed him the follow-up checklist. "He needs surgery consult. Today, not tomorrow." "I'll make the call." He paused. "I also want you to know about Calloway's report. I spoke to Director Hassan this morning." Emily waited. "I told her what I observed in the trauma bay yesterday, my perspective on the clinical decision." He said it carefully, the way a man who works in a political environment says things that have political weight. "I'm not telling you it fixes anything. I'm telling you she has my account of it." "I appreciate that," Emily said, and she did, genuinely, while also knowing that Calloway's report and Osei's account and whatever Director Hassan decided to do with both of them was a problem that existed in a different register than the problem of who had been inside Marcus Holt's ICU room at 3:40 in the morning with obscured credentials. She thanked him and moved on. The morning escalated the way mornings in the ER escalated, not dramatically, not with any single catastrophic event, but through accumulation, the slow addition of cases and complications, and the particular friction of a department that was understaffed by one physician because Dr. Renata Solis had called in sick and her coverage wasn't arriving until noon. Emily moved through it with the focused efficiency that Patrice had once described, not unkindly, as robotic, which Emily had taken as a compliment because Patrice had meant it as one. At 9:15, Director Hassan appeared in the ER. Eleanor Hassan was 53, with the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years managing institutional crises and had developed a specific, unflappable quality as a result. She was not a warm administrator. She was not particularly cold either. She was precise, which Emily had always respected more than warmth in someone with institutional authority. She found Emily at the nursing station and asked, in the straightforward tone of someone who had decided how they were going to handle a conversation before they walked into it, if Emily had a moment. They stood in the small office adjacent to the nursing station that was nominally for private conversations, which in practice meant it had a door that mostly muffled sound. "I've read Dr. Calloway's incident report," Hassan said. "I've also read Dr. Osie's account, which he submitted this morning, and I've pulled the patient chart and the monitor logs from yesterday's trauma bay." Emily waited. The monitor logs show the patient's oxygen saturation was at 88% and declining at the time of your intervention. The tracheal deviation was documented by Dr. Osei in his post-procedure note. Hassan looked at her with the evaluating quality of someone who was deciding what to do with a complicated fact. "I'm not going to tell you that the way you handled it was within standard protocol, because it wasn't. I'm also not going to tell you the patient would have survived if you'd deferred to Dr. Calloway, because the evidence doesn't support that conclusion." "What are you telling me?" Emily said. "I'm telling you that the incident report will be reviewed by the committee in 10 days. I'm telling you that Dr. Calloway has formally requested a review of your nursing privileges, and that review will happen concurrent with the incident report process." She paused. "And I'm telling you, off the record, that the committee will have access to the monitor logs, and that Dr. Osei has agreed to present his account in person." Emily held her gaze. "And Dr. Calloway will also present his account." Hassan picked up the folder she'd brought. "In the meantime, you remain on shift as normal. There's no suspension pending, but I want you to understand the landscape." "I understand it," Emily said. Hassan left. Emily stood in the small office for a moment after the door closed, looking at the wall, and then she went back to the nursing station because there were 3 patients with pending labs, and Walter Greer was being evaluated for surgical consult, and the morning had not stopped moving while she was in that office. At 11:20, her phone buzzed again. Not Novak this time. An unfamiliar number, no area code she recognized, and the text was 2 sentences that she read 3 times standing in the medication room with the door closed. "We know you were with him last night. Walk away from this and nothing changes for you." She stood there for a moment. The medication room was small and smelled of antiseptic, and the hum of the climate-controlled cabinet where the temperature-sensitive medications were stored was the only sound. She read the text again. "Nothing changes for you." It was almost politely phrased, almost reasonable in its structure. The structure of people who were practiced at this kind of communication, specific enough to convey that they had information, vague enough to maintain deniability. She forwarded it to Novak's number with a single line. "This just came in." The response came back faster than she expected. "Screenshot and preserve. Do not reply. Are you still in the building? Yes. Stay in the building. We're aware." She put her phone in her pocket and finished counting the medication she'd been counting when the text came in and went back to work. The problem with staying in the building was that the building was not a secure location. It had 4 public entrances, a loading dock that was operated on an honor system of staff familiarity, a parking structure with a single attendant who worked a booth from 7 to 3 and was replaced by an automated gate after hours, and approximately 460 staff members, whose credentials had varying degrees of access to various floors. Someone had walked into the ICU at 3:40 in the morning with a face obscured and staff credentials. That person was probably not gone. That person, or the people connected to that person, now knew Emily had been with Marcus Holt last night and had decided, or been instructed, to make contact. She thought about all of this while she checked on Walter Greer, who had been told he needed surgery and had received the news with the particular resigned acceptance of someone who had suspected it for a while and was mostly relieved to have the suspicion confirmed. She thought about it while she updated a medication chart, and answered a question from a paramedic about protocol, and poured herself coffee she didn't intend to drink. She thought about it in the specific compartmentalized way she had been trained to think about threats, not pushing it aside, not letting it take over, but holding it in a designated space where it could be monitored without consuming the attention she needed for everything else. At 12:40, Dr. Calloway appeared in the ER hallway. He was not scheduled for afternoon shift. He was in street clothes, dark jacket, slacks, and he had the look of a man who had come in specifically rather than happening to be there. He saw Emily at the nursing station and walked toward her with the deliberate pace of someone who had thought about this approach. "I want to be clear about something," he said, pitching his voice low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them, "before the committee process begins." Emily looked at him. "What I filed yesterday was a factual account of a protocol violation. It wasn't personal. You've said that. I'm saying it again because I want you to understand that the review process is going to bring scrutiny to your entire employment record here, not just yesterday. All of it." He held her gaze. "There have been other instances. Other times you've gone outside your documented scope. I have notes going back 14 months. Emily kept her expression neutral. "I'm sure you do. I'm giving you the opportunity to resign before the committee convenes. It would be cleaner for everyone." She looked at him for a long moment. Not the look of someone processing a threat, not the look of someone managing emotions, but the particular look of someone who has been in situations considerably more dangerous than a hospital hallway conversation with a difficult administrator and is running the comparison involuntarily. "No," she said. "Carter, no," she said again. "File everything you have. Present it to the committee. Let the monitor logs and Dr. Osie's account sit in the same room as your 14 months of notes." She picked up her chart. "I'll be there." She walked away from him, not fast, not with any performance of it, just walked back to the work in front of her. But her hands, for just a moment, were tight on the chart. The afternoon brought 3 new admits and the coverage physician who replaced the absent Dr. Solis, a locum named Dr. Prescott, who was competent and unobtrusive, and had the significant professional virtue of not having any preformed opinions about Emily Carter. She moved through the afternoon with a rhythm that almost felt normal, the kind of focused forward motion that had always been her best protection against the thing underneath. The awareness, constant now, that the shape of her carefully constructed life here had fundamentally changed in the last 22 hours and was not going to change back. At 3:30, Novak called. Emily stepped into the stairwell between the second and third floors. The way she had learned during her first month here, that the stairwells were the only places in the building without ambient noise from the department systems. "Go ahead." "We moved him at 11. New location, secure. He's stable." Novak's voice was the same neutral efficiency it had been last night. Information without ornamentation. "The access incident at 3:40 is being investigated. The credentials used were registered to a respiratory therapist who reported her badge missing 4 days ago. So they've had access for 4 days. At minimum." Emily absorbed that. "The drive." "He had it on him. We have it now." "What's on it?" A pause. "That's not something I'm in a position to." "He told me last night it was a weapons operation, 40 miles north off Route 9. He said he had 7 months of documentation." She kept her voice flat and even. "I need to understand the scope of what he walked into before I can understand the scope of what's coming toward this hospital." Another pause, longer. "The operation involves arms trafficking, military-grade hardware, some of it classified. The Route 9 property is a staging location, not the origin point, not the end point. There are 8 confirmed individuals connected to the network so far, several with prior military or law enforcement backgrounds." Novak stopped. "Captain Holt's documentation has the potential to be the center of a federal case. That's why they want him dead." Emily stood in the stairwell with this information and felt its weight settle into the space where she kept assessments like this. Not personal, not frightening, just data with consequences. "The text I forwarded to you," she said. "Can you trace it?" "We're working on it. Don't expect fast results." "What do you want me to do?" "Right now, continue your shift. Behave normally. We have eyes on the building." Another pause. "And Carter, Captain Holt wanted me to tell you something." "What?" He said the drive has something on it beyond the trafficking documentation. Records that were accessed without authorization from a military personnel database. Specifically, records that were accessed 18 months ago by someone looking into a personnel file flagged as classified, KIA notation, Air Force, Special Operations. She paused. He said you'd understand what that means. Emily was quiet. He said the people who shot him weren't just trying to stop the trafficking documentation, Novak said. He said they were trying to stop someone from finding out those records were accessed. And he said the file that was accessed was yours. The stairwell was very quiet. Somewhere below her, a door opened and closed. Footsteps going up, then going past, then gone. I'll call you after my shift, Emily said. She went back to the department. What? The last 2 hours of her shift were the hardest she had worked to maintain a surface because the surface, for the first time in 2 years, had a specific and present reason to crack. Someone had accessed her classified personnel file 18 months ago. Her file, the one flagged as KIA, the one that was supposed to be sealed in a way that made it functionally unreachable without authorization that almost no one possessed. Someone had reached it, someone had looked, and that someone was connected to the people who had shot Marcus Holt on Route 9 and sent a politely worded text to her phone this morning and accessed the ICU at 3:40 in the morning with a stolen badge. She changed a dressing on a burn patient and noted the wound's progress accurately and pleasantly and recommended a follow-up in 3 days. She helped the overnight charge nurse, who arrived at 6:45 for handover, with 2 outstanding charts that needed closing notes. She answered Afolabi's question about a medication interaction with the same patient she always brought to Afolabi's questions. She did all of this while the thing Novak had told her ran quietly underneath like a current she wasn't letting herself look at directly. At 7:10, she clocked out. She retrieved her bag from behind the nursing station. She put on her jacket in the locker room. She was almost to the side exit when she heard Patrice's voice behind her. Emily? She turned. Patrice was standing at the end of the hallway, and she was not alone. Behind her, partially in the shadow of the corridor junction, was a man in a dark jacket who was not hospital staff. Emily clocked that in half a second, the absence of a badge, the posture, the shoes. I was young, late 20s maybe, and he had the kind of controlled stillness that she recognized from context she was not supposed to remember. Patrice looked uncomfortable. Someone's here to see you. He said it's urgent. He said... She stopped. He said to tell you Kestrel. Same as before. Emily looked at the man. He looked back at her. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, and withdrew a folded piece of paper and held it out. She crossed the hallway and took it. She unfolded it. It was a photograph printed on plain paper. Aerial view, taken from altitude, showing a building complex and a road and tree cover. In the margin, handwritten in a compact, precise hand she didn't recognize, they burned the staging location 2 hours ago. Evidence destruction. This is what they do when they feel the net closing. She looked at the man. Captain Holt's contact sent me, he said. My name is Decker. I've been running surveillance on the Route 9 property for 6 weeks. The fire started at 5:15 this afternoon. He paused. They know the drive exists. They know it's out of their reach now, so they're doing damage control and pressure simultaneously. He looked at her steadily. The text you got this morning wasn't a warning, it was a test. They wanted to see if you'd run. I didn't run, Emily said. I know, that's why they escalated. He took the photograph back and refolded it. There's a vehicle outside. Lieutenant Commander Novak wants to brief you tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. There's something on the drive that changes the timeline. Emily held his gaze for a moment. She thought about her house on the east side of Kelton, empty and quiet, and radiating the careful impersonality she had built into it. She thought about the incident report on Director Hassan's desk, and Calloway's 14 months of notes, and the committee review in 10 days. She thought about her file, flagged KIA, accessed 18 months ago by someone who was now connected to a weapons trafficking network that was currently burning down its own facilities to destroy evidence. Give me 2 minutes, she said. She went back to the locker room. She opened her locker and reached past her street shoes and her spare set of scrubs, and the small emergency kit she had kept in every locker she'd ever had since she was 22 years old. Tourniquet, pressure bandage, 2 individually wrapped sutures, a sealed irrigation syringe. She took the kit. She closed the locker. She walked back out to Decker, who was waiting exactly where she'd left him, in the same posture, with the same stillness. Let's go, she said. But as they moved toward the exit, Patrice caught her arm. Just briefly, fingers on her elbow, the grip of someone who didn't know what was happening but knew it was more than a normal end of shift. "Emily." Her voice was low. "What is this?" Emily looked at her. At Patrice's face, worn down by years of institutional grind and genuine care for the people she worked alongside, the face of someone who deserved a real answer. "I don't know yet," Emily said. And that at least was completely true. She walked out through the side exit into the cold evening air, and the door closed behind her, and somewhere in the parking structure a vehicle's lights came on. The vehicle was a dark gray SUV, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle that disappeared into any parking structure in any American city without registering. Decker held the rear door, and Emily got in without hesitating, because hesitating in a parking structure after dark, when you had already committed to getting in the vehicle, was the kind of indecision that served no one. Lieutenant Commander Adele Novak was in the front passenger seat. She was younger than her voice had suggested on the phone. Mid-30s, short hair, the particular posture of someone who had spent years in environments that required constant physical readiness and had simply stopped relaxing as a default setting. She turned in her seat as the driver, a man Emily didn't know, didn't ask about, pulled out of the structure and into the street. "Thank you for coming," Novak said. "You said the drive changed the timeline," Emily said. "Tell me what's on it." Novak looked at her for a moment with the evaluating quality of someone deciding how much to front-load. Then she opened a tablet and turned it so Emily could see the screen. "The trafficking operation is the surface layer," she said. "Military-grade weapons, rifles, crew-served systems, 2 confirmed man-pads, being moved through the Route 9 staging location to buyers we've identified in 3 countries. Captain Holt's documentation covers the logistics chain, the money movement, 4 of the 8 principal actors." She swiped to the next screen. "But the deeper layer is this. Someone inside the military personnel record system has been accessing classified files. Not randomly. Specifically. All of the files belong to operators whose missions overlapped with the origin points of the weapons we're tracking." Emily looked at the screen. She kept her face still. "The weapons didn't come from a black market supplier," Novak continued. "They were diverted from active military inventory through a falsified loss and destruction reporting chain. Somebody inside, with access, with rank, with the ability to make hardware disappear on paper, has been feeding this network for at least 3 years." She paused. "The personnel files being accessed are the operators who could have witnessed that diversion, who were in the field when certain shipments went missing. They're identifying witnesses," Emily said, "and determining which ones are still active enough to be credible, which ones have left service, which ones might talk." Novak held her gaze. "Your file was accessed 14 months ago. The access came from a terminal inside a military administrative building in a location I'm not going to name in a moving vehicle. But the access was not authorized. Whoever pulled your file had credentials, but those credentials were used outside their designated scope." Emily looked out the window. The streets of Kelton moved past. A gas station, a fast food place still lit up, ordinary Tuesday evening, people going about ordinary things. "What mission?" she said. "I'm sorry?" "Which mission did my file overlap with, in terms of the weapons diversion?" Novak was quiet for 3 seconds. "Verdal sector. Approximately 4 years ago. There was a reported loss of a weapons consignment during a transition between forward operating bases. The official record shows the loss as enemy action. Captain Holt was there. So were 2 other operators whose files were also accessed." She paused. "So were you?" Emily said nothing. She remembered Verdal sector. She remembered the transition. She remembered a lot of things about that period that she had put considerable effort into not actively remembering, and she was not going to open that door in the back seat of an unfamiliar SUV on a Tuesday evening in Kelton because there wasn't room for it and it wouldn't help anything. "What changed on the timeline?" she said. "The fire at the Route 9 facility. They burned it 2 hours after we secured the drive. That's not the behavior of a network that thinks it still has options. That's the behavior of a network that knows the documentation exists and is in federal hands and is cutting losses." Novak turned back to face forward. "But burning a staging location is also the behavior of a network that's decided to simplify its risk profile. Fewer locations, fewer witnesses." She paused. "Captain Holt was their highest priority. Now that he's secure, you're the next logical target. Not because of the drive. They don't know what you know or don't know, but because you were seen with him, because your file was pulled 14 months ago, and whatever that search turned up made you a known variable to someone in this network. Where are you taking me? Emily said. Safe location. We need your account of everything Holt told you, on record, tonight, and we need to discuss your security situation going forward. I have a shift tomorrow morning. Novak looked at her. Ms. Carter, I have patience. I have a woman recovering from cardiac intervention, a man 2 days post-op from a perforated ulcer repair. I have a committee review in 9 days that I need to be present for. She held Novak's gaze. I'm not disappearing. Whatever you need from me tonight, we do tonight, and then I go back. A pause. The driver didn't react. Novak looked at her with something that shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite reassessment, but a recalibration of some assumption she'd arrived with. All right, she said. Tonight. What? The safe location was a rented house on the north side of Kelton, unremarkable from the outside, the inside converted into a functional operational space with the specific impermanence of a temporary installation. Folding tables, secured laptops, a whiteboard covered in a network diagram that Emily scanned in the first 4 seconds and then deliberately looked away from because she hadn't been invited to absorb it yet. 2 other people were in the room, both in plain clothes, both with the bearing. Nobody introduced themselves by anything other than first names, and Emily didn't ask. She gave her account. All of it. The trauma bay, the decompression, what Holt had said to her in the ICU, the text she'd received, the conversation with Novak on the phone, everything up through Decker appearing in the hallway with a photograph of a burning facility. She gave it in the order it happened, without editorializing, in the flat, precise delivery she had been trained to use for after-action reporting. The woman at the folding table took notes without looking up. The man by the window listened without expression. When she finished, Novak asked 3 follow-up questions, all of them specific, all of them about timing. Emily answered them accurately. Then Novak said, the person whose credentials were used in the ICU at 3:40, the respiratory therapist whose badge went missing. Maggie Tran, Emily said, because she'd looked up the name that morning after Novak mentioned it. She's been on staff for 6 years, no disciplinary history. She reported the badge missing 4 days ago, which means the access window opened 4 days ago. But we think the planning went further back than that. Novak pulled up something on the laptop. The text you received this morning was traced to a burner purchased 11 days ago in a town 60 miles east of Kelton. She turned the screen. The cell tower data puts the burner in Kelton for the last 4 days. Whoever sent that text has been here, in this city, for 4 days. Emily looked at the screen. They came here before Holt was shot. Holt was shot on Route 9. That's their territory. They moved on him there. But someone was already in Kelton before that. Pre-positioned. Novak paused. We don't think Harlow County General was a coincidence. We think they knew the most likely hospital for a Route 9 trauma case, and they had someone in position before Holt was even transported. Emily was quiet. We think there may be a secondary actor inside the hospital, Novak said. Not a principal. Someone being used, compensated, possibly not fully aware of the scope of what they're involved in, but someone who has been providing information about your movements. Emily thought about the medication room. She thought about Calloway appearing there that afternoon in street clothes. She thought about 14 months of notes, which was a very specific time frame that aligned uncomfortably closely with when her personnel file had been accessed. She didn't say any of this out loud. Not yet. She needed to sit with it before she handed it to anyone. What do you need from me tonight? She said. A formal statement, signed, and we need you to look at some photographs. The photographs were surveillance images. The grainy, specific quality of long-range cameras working in low light. Faces, some clear, some partial. She went through them slowly, the way she had been taught to go through imagery, not rushing to recognition, not forcing the match, just looking. She got through 11 images without anything registering. The 12th made her stop. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Who is this?" Novak leaned over. "You recognize him?" "I'm not certain." She looked at the image. The man in it was photographed from above and to the left, so what she had was three-quarter profile, jawline, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he stood. He was at the hospital today. Not as a patient. He was in the main corridor around noon, near the elevator bank on the first floor. I noticed him because he wasn't wearing a badge and he was standing still for too long. Novak took the tablet back. She looked at the man beside the window. Something passed between them that was too quick for Emily to read. His name is Gareth Collis, Novak said. He's a former Army logistics officer, separated from service 3 years ago under circumstances that didn't make it into his official record cleanly. He's connected to 2 of the 8 principal actors in Holt's documentation. She set the tablet down. He was inside Harlow County General today. The room was quiet. Then I need to get back, Emily said. Whoops. They didn't want her to go back that night. Novak made the case for a secured location with the careful persistence of someone who understood they were making the case to a person who had already decided. Emily listened to the full argument, which was reasonable and thorough and based on a legitimate threat assessment, and then she said that if Gareth Collis had been inside the hospital that afternoon and was potentially connected to a secondary actor on the inside, then the people in that hospital were in a threat environment they knew nothing about, and she was not going to sit in a safe house on the north side of Kelton while that was true. Novak looked at her for a long moment. "We'll have people on the building," she said. "External. You call the moment anything changes." "I know how to call," Emily said. Decker drove her home at 11:40. She packed a bag. Not large, the kind of bag she had packed many times for many different reasons, things chosen for utility rather than comfort. She slept 3 hours. She woke at 4:30 because her body had its own alarm system that had never fully decommissioned, made coffee, drank all of it this time, and drove to Harlow County General in the dark. Same. It always looked the same from the outside. She badged in through the side entrance, moved through the corridor, and was at the nursing station before 5:30, running through the overnight census before Patrice finished her notes. "You're here early, even for you," Patrice said. "Couldn't sleep," Emily said, which was true enough. The morning was quiet for the first 2 hours, the specific pre-dawn quiet of a hospital that hasn't yet shifted into its daytime rhythm. Emily used it. She was systematic about it, moving through the floors she had access to with the unhurried appearance of someone doing normal early rounds, while actually running a different kind of assessment. Who was where? Who had changed their usual pattern? Which doors had been propped? She had done this kind of environmental scan in buildings considerably more dangerous than a regional hospital, and she trusted it. She didn't find anything obvious, which didn't mean nothing was there. At 7:20, the day shift began arriving. Dr. Prescott was back as coverage. Calloway was not scheduled. Afalabi came in looking like she had been studying all night, which she probably had. The department filled up and found its rhythm, and Emily moved with it, doing the job, monitoring the edges. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. Novak. Collis's vehicle was tracked to a motel 6 miles east of Kelton last night. He checked out at 0600 this morning. We don't have his current location. Emily read the text 3 times. Then she replied, "Understood." She put the phone away and looked at the department around her. The patients in their beds, the staff moving between them, the ordinary machinery of a place that existed to keep people alive. And she felt the specific quality of a situation that was about to change and couldn't be stopped from changing. She went back to work, and she waited. The call came at 1:47 in the afternoon. Not her phone. The main desk. Patrice picked it up, listened for a moment, and then looked across the department at Emily with an expression Emily had not seen on her face before. Patrice held the phone out. Emily crossed the department and took it. "Carter." The voice was male, mid-range, controlled. Not Decker. Not anyone she'd spoken to in the last 48 hours. "My name isn't important. I want you to listen carefully because I'm only going to say this once." "I'm listening," she said. "We have a problem that you can help resolve, and if you help resolve it, this ends cleanly for everyone involved. I need you to come outside, the ambulance bay, 5 minutes. I'm on shift. I know you're on shift. I know your badge number and your locker combination, and I know you drove a blue Honda with a cracked left tail light to work this morning. Come outside or we make this complicated in a way that affects people inside that building." The line went dead. Emily stood at the nursing station for 4 seconds with the phone in her hand. She looked at Patrice, who was watching her with the controlled alarm of someone who had heard enough of the conversation to know something was wrong. She looked at the department, the patients, the staff, the ordinary afternoon of a regional ER. She put the phone down and pulled out her own phone and sent a single text to Novak. Ambulance bay. Now. Come quiet. Then she looked at Patrice. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, she said, call security and tell them there's an unauthorized individual in or near the ambulance bay. Don't go outside yourself. Emily. 10 minutes, Emily said. She walked toward the ambulance bay. The bay was quiet at this hour. The morning rush had passed, afternoon cases not yet stacking up. One ambulance was backed in, crew doing their post-run restock. 2 of them. She clocked them, registered their presence as a complicating factor, and kept moving toward the exterior. The man was standing at the far edge of the bay, near the concrete pillar at the corner, in the specific position of someone who had chosen their location with attention to sightlines. He was in his 40s, heavy-set, with a face that had been weathered into something hard and flat. He was not Gareth Collis. He was someone she hadn't seen before, which meant either the surveillance photographs hadn't been complete, or this was a different actor entirely. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, both of them. Emily stopped 12 feet away, far enough. You wanted to talk, she said. What Holt gave the feds doesn't have to be a problem, the man said. Documentation can be challenged. Evidence gets questioned. Witnesses have complicated histories. He looked at her with the flat, evaluating gaze of someone conducting an assessment. But you complicate things differently, because you were there. Vertal sector. You know what happened with that shipment. I know what was reported, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. Something moved in his eyes. We need to know what you remember, specifically. And we need to know who you've talked to since Holt came into your ER. I've talked to a lot of people. It's a hospital. Don't do that, he said. His voice didn't rise. I know you're not actually a nurse who stumbled into something. I know what your file says before the KIA notation. I know what Wraith means to the people who know what it means. He took one hand out of his jacket pocket, and Emily's attention sharpened to a precise point, but the hand was empty. He ran it over his jaw. Which is why I'm talking to you instead of doing this a different way. Because you're not someone you do things the messy way with. What do you want? She said. A conversation. Private. Not here. He glanced at the ambulance crew, who were absorbed in their restock and apparently registering nothing. Come with me. You answer some questions. We confirm you're not going to be a problem. And then this is finished for you. Emily looked at him. She looked at his posture, his hands, the position of the concrete pillar behind him, the vehicle she could see pulled onto the service road behind the bay. Another dark SUV, engine off, one figure visible in the front seat. No, she said. He blinked. It was the only thing that moved in his face. I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm not having a private conversation with you. And whatever you think you know about Vertal sector, whatever you pulled from a file that was accessed without authorization 18 months ago, it isn't going to give you what you're looking for. She held his gaze. Because you don't actually know what I know, and you don't know who I've already talked to. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's a mistake. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. He looked at her for 3 seconds that were very long, and then something in his assessment shifted. Not retreat, not yet, but recalculation. He put his hand back in his pocket. He took one step to the left. It was at that precise moment that 2 things happened simultaneously. The first was a sound from the service road, a vehicle moving fast, and then a second vehicle, and then the rapid controlled shout of law enforcement identification. The second was the ambulance bay doors behind Emily bursting open and Decker coming through them at a speed that was not casual, with 2 people behind him, all 3 of them moving with the specific compressed urgency of a team that had practiced this. The man by the pillar turned. He got his hand out of his jacket. What was in it cleared the pocket and then stopped there because Decker was faster and the 2 people behind him had already split to flank, and the service road was already controlled, and the ambulance crew, who were not actually restocking their ambulance but had been in that bay for 40 minutes waiting, had already moved to positions that closed the remaining angles. Emily had taken 3 steps to the right when the doors opened, clearing her own sightline, because old habits were not actually habits. They were structural, they were load-bearing. They did not leave when everything else about your life changed. The man by the pillar looked at the positions around him. He looked at Emily. He put the weapon on the ground. What? It took 22 minutes to secure the scene, identify the individual in the SUV on the service road as a second actor, and establish a perimeter. Emily stood at the edge of the ambulance bay and watched it happen with the particular quality of attention she reserved for situations that were still active. Not relaxed, not relieved, just watching and assessing and confirming at each interval that the geometry of the situation had not changed in a way that required different action. Novak appeared at her shoulder at the 14-minute mark. "You should have waited," Novak said. "If I'd waited, he would have left and you wouldn't have had a location on him. We had the building under surveillance. You had the perimeter. He was already inside your perimeter. He had been for at least 20 minutes before he called the desk." Emily watched the man by the pillar being cuffed and walked to a federal vehicle. The position he chose, that pillar, it was outside the primary camera coverage for the bay. Whoever planned his approach to me mapped the hospital's camera system first. Novak was quiet for a moment. "The secondary actor inside," she said. "We think we've identified them." Emily looked at her. Collis's phone records from the last 4 days show 6 calls to a number registered to a prepaid phone purchased in Kelton. We triangulated the prepaid's locations using tower data. She paused. It was used twice from inside Harlow County General. Once from the administrative floor, once from the ER wing. Administrative floor. Emily thought about Calloway in his street clothes, appearing mid-afternoon on a day he wasn't scheduled, with 14 months of documented grievances and access to her employment record and movement patterns, and she realized the specific knowledge of exactly which shifts she worked and which days she'd be in that building. "You need to bring him in," Emily said. "We need more than tower data for an arrest." "Then get more. Fast." She looked at Novak directly. "Because if he knows what happened in this bay in the last 20 minutes, he's going to run." Novak was already reaching for her phone. Emily turned back toward the hospital doors. She needed to get back to the department. She needed to check on her patients. She needed to act, for as long as she could manage it, like a woman who had stepped outside for 10 minutes and was now returning to her shift. She pushed through the ambulance bay doors and walked back into Harlow County General, and the fluorescent lights came down on her the way they always did. Indifferent and institutional, and exactly the same as they'd been every other time she'd walked back through these doors, as if the world inside had no knowledge of what happened just outside its walls. Patrice was at the nursing station. She looked at Emily the way she had looked at her for the past 2 days, with the careful attention of someone who had decided to trust a person without fully understanding why. "Everything okay?" Patrice asked. Emily picked up the chart she'd left on the desk. "Fine," she said. "What did I miss?" She made it 6 steps before her phone buzzed. Novak, 1 line. Calloway just accessed the hospital's security camera system from a workstation on the administrative floor. He's watching the ambulance bay footage right now. Emily stopped walking. She looked at the chart in her hands. She looked at the department around her, the patients, the staff, the movement and noise of a functioning ER that had no idea that the man who had been its chief for 3 years was at this moment watching surveillance footage of a federal takedown in its ambulance bay and calculating what it meant for him. She looked at this elevator at the end of the corridor, the one that went to the administrative floor. Her phone buzzed again. "Don't go up there. We're sending people." She looked at the elevator. She thought about 14 months of notes. She thought about the incident report on Director Hassan's desk. She thought about Constance Beaumont's STEMI and Walter Greer's perforated ulcer and the 14-gauge needle she'd put in Marcus Holt's chest while Calloway told her to step back, and the specific patient load-bearing weight of 2 years of being told she was less than what she was by a man who had apparently been feeding her location and her schedule and her patterns to people who wanted to know them. She put her phone back in her pocket. The elevator doors opened. She got in. The elevator took 11 seconds to reach the administrative floor, which was 11 seconds of standing still in a small box while her phone buzzed twice more with messages she didn't look at. And she used those 11 seconds to run the geometry of what she was walking into and what she intended to do when she got there. She was not going up there to confront Calloway. She understood that impulse, and she was setting it aside because confrontation without documentation was just noise, and noise had never been her instrument. She was going up there because if Calloway was watching the ambulance bay footage right now, he was also deciding something, whether to run, whether to delete, whether to make a call to a number that would connect him to people who were already in federal custody or very shortly would be. She needed to see which direction he moved before Novak's people arrived, because the direction he moved was itself information. The doors opened. The administrative floor had the particular quiet of offices after noon, most of the staff cycling between lunch and afternoon tasks, the rhythm slower than the ER below. Emily knew the layout. She had been up here twice before, both times for meetings she hadn't wanted to attend. The security workstation was a glass-walled room off the main corridor, the kind of transparency that was meant to signal accountability, and in practice meant anyone walking by could see who was inside. Calloway was inside. He was standing at the workstation monitor rather than sitting, which was the posture of someone who intended to stay for a short time, and he was leaning forward with both hands on the desk, watching the screen with an intensity that had nothing casual in it. Emily slowed her pace as she passed the glass. She didn't stop. She kept walking at the same measured rate, glancing in the way that any passing employee might glance at something in their peripheral vision, registering, not dwelling. What she saw in 3 seconds: the monitor showing the ambulance bay feed, frozen on an image she recognized as the moment the federal vehicle had pulled onto the service road. Calloway's face, which had a quality she had not seen there before. Not the settled certainty she was accustomed to, but something disrupted. The expression of a man whose internal map had just shown him a location that didn't exist. She kept walking to the end of the corridor. She turned the corner. She stopped. She pulled out her phone. Novak picked up before the second ring. "I told you not to go up there." "He's in the security workstation. He's got the footage paused. He hasn't moved yet." She kept her voice low. "How far out are your people?" 4 minutes. "He's going to move in less than 4 minutes. Once he processes what he's seen on that screen, he's going to make a decision and execute it." "Carter, you need to step back and let us—" "I'm not going to do anything. I'm telling you what the clock looks like from here." She paused. "Does Director Hassan know yet?" "She's been notified. She's in her office." Emily looked at the corner she'd turned. "Send Hassan to the security workstation right now, before your people arrive. Calloway won't run from his own hospital director. He'll try to explain, and whatever he says trying to explain is going to be on the workstation's audio log." A pause. Longer than Emily expected. Yes. Hold on." Emily stood at the end of the corridor and listened to the administrative floor's quiet and the faint mechanical hum of the building's systems and the distant sound of the elevator moving somewhere below. She looked at the corner. She did not go back around it. 50 seconds later, she heard Director Hassan's voice from the direction of the security workstation. Measured, neutral, the voice of a woman who had been briefed en route and was performing normalcy with professional precision. "Dr. Calloway, I didn't expect to see you here today." Emily couldn't see them, but she could hear it, the specific acoustics of the corridor carrying sound further than people in the security room probably realized. There was something on the exterior cameras I wanted to check." Calloway's voice. And there it was, already. The register was different. Not the confident, controlled delivery he used in the ER. Something compressed, operating under pressure it wasn't accustomed to. "The ambulance bay?" Hassan said. "Yes, there was an incident this afternoon. The federal agents who are currently in the building would be the appropriate people to speak with about that." A pause. "Dr. Calloway, are you all right? You look unwell." "I'm fine." "You're not scheduled today. Did you come in specifically to use the security workstation?" Silence. "Because the access log will show the time of entry," Hassan continued in the same conversational tone, "and I'll be reviewing it this afternoon along with some other access records that have come to my attention." Another silence, and this one had a different quality. The silence of someone whose options were collapsing in real time and who was running the remaining inventory and finding it insufficient. Emily heard the elevator doors open at the end of the corridor behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard 2 sets of footsteps moving past her with purpose. Novak's people, moving toward the security workstation. She turned the corner. The scene in the security workstation was not dramatic. That was the thing about these moments when they actually happened. They rarely looked the way the weight of them suggested they should. Calloway was standing at the desk with his hands at his sides, and Hassan was 2 steps inside the door, and the 2 federal agents were positioned in the corridor outside the glass in a way that communicated clearly without requiring any verbal statement. Calloway looked at the agents. He looked at Hassan. He looked at Emily, who had stopped in the corridor and was visible through the glass. and what passed across his face in that moment was complex enough that she couldn't fully parse it. Something between recognition and something older than recognition. "Dr. Calloway," one of the agents said, stepping into the doorway, "we need to ask you to come with us." "I want to call my attorney," Calloway said. "That's your right. You can do that from our office." He didn't resist. He walked out of the security workstation with his hands visible and his chin up in the particular way of a man who had decided that dignity was the one remaining thing he could control. And Emily stepped back to let him pass in the corridor, and he looked at her as he went by with an expression she had not seen on his face in 2 years of working under him. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the expression of someone seeing another person clearly for the first time. She didn't say anything to him. There was nothing to say that the next several weeks wouldn't say more precisely. Novak found her 20 minutes later in the stairwell between the third and second floors, where Emily had gone because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't full of people looking at her. She was sitting on the concrete step with her back against the wall and a bottle of water she'd taken from the nursing station, which she was holding but not drinking. Novak sat down 2 steps above her. It was an unusual choice of location for a federal officer conducting official business, and Emily appreciated it without saying so. "The 2 individuals from the ambulance bay are in federal custody," Novak said. "The man who called you is a former military contractor named Terrence Bale. He's been connected to the network for at least 2 years. The individual in the vehicle was a local. Paid transportation, probably doesn't know the full scope of what he was involved in." Emily nodded. "Calloway is being interviewed. We have the call records. 6 contacts between his prepaid phone and Callis over 4 days. We have the access log from the security workstation showing he pulled your employment records 3 times in the last 14 months and emailed summaries to an external account." She paused. "The external account traces to a shell company that's been identified in Holt's documentation." Emily looked at the water bottle. "How long did he know?" "Our current estimate is that he was approached approximately 16 months ago, based on the timing of initial contacts." Novak was quiet for a moment. He wasn't a principal actor. He was peripheral, a source of information. He probably told himself it was minimal involvement, that he was just answering questions about an employee. "He filed an incident report trying to end my career," Emily said. "He told me to resign. Yes. He was trying to remove me from the building before whatever they were planning reached the point it reached yesterday." "That's our assessment." Emily was quiet for a while. She thought about the specific texture of 2 years, the accumulated small dismissals, the protocol citations, the particular way he said "you're a nurse, Carter," as if the words were a fence he was maintaining around a perimeter he needed to hold. She had always attributed it to institutional arrogance, the ordinary small corruption of unchecked authority. It had been that. It had also been something more calculated and considerably worse. "Marcus Holt," she said. "What happens to his testimony?" "His documentation is already in federal hands. It's been processed and verified. His testimony is part of the case, but it's not the case. The documentary evidence is sufficient to support the investigation independently." Novak paused. "He's being moved to a secure medical facility. His prognosis is good. He's going to need someone to review his chest tube output parameters when they transfer him. The drainage was trending at the high end of acceptable when I last checked his numbers." Novak looked at her. "I'll tell the receiving facility. Tell them specifically. Don't just say monitor for complications. Give them the number, 600 milliliters in the first 24 hours trending. If it hits that threshold before the tube is pulled, they need to image first." "I'll pass that on," Novak said, and her voice had shifted very slightly. Not softer, but something in the precision of her attention had changed, the way it did when someone was revising an estimate. Emily stood up. She rolled her shoulders once, the way she did when she'd been in a static position too long. "I need to finish my shift." "Carter." Novak stood as well. "For what it's worth, the way you handled the ambulance bay, coming out to meet Bale instead of waiting. That drew him into our perimeter rather than requiring us to locate him." "I know," Emily said. "It was also extremely stupid from a personal safety standpoint." "Also, yes," Emily said. She pushed through the stairwell door back onto the second-floor corridor. She finished her shift. It was the strangest thing, in retrospect, that the afternoon continued, that the department didn't know what had happened on its own premises, that Afalabi was still asking careful, thoughtful questions, and the burn patient in bed. 9 needed his dressing changed, and a new admission came in through the ambulance bay at 4:40 with a crush injury that required the kind of focused, rapid triage that left no room for anything else. Emily worked through all of it. She was not on autopilot. She was fully present, maybe more present than she'd been in weeks, because the particular clearing that happens when a long-held threat finally resolves has a quality of sharpened attention that she recognized from other contexts. At 6:30, Director Hassan came to the ER. She stood at the nursing station and asked Patrice if she could have a word with Emily, which was the kind of request that emptied a room with remarkable efficiency. Patrice manufactured a reason to be elsewhere. The resident found something urgent to do in bed 3. Hassan and Emily were left in the relative privacy of the station's corner. "The committee review scheduled for next week," Hassan said. "It's been withdrawn." Emily looked at her. "Dr. Calloway's incident report has been formally retracted from the review file, given the circumstances." Hassan's expression was the controlled neutral of someone managing a situation that was significantly outside normal administrative parameters. "I also want to address the broader pattern of documentation in your file, the record of complaints, the restriction requests, the formal citations. In light of what we now know about Dr. Calloway's external contacts and his documented pattern of accessing your personnel information, I've asked HR to conduct a full audit." "I appreciate that," Emily said. "I also owe you an apology," Hassan said, and the words had a specific weight, not uncomfortable exactly, but carrying the gravity of someone who did not say them lightly. "The volume of documentation against you was, I relied on its face value more than I should have, without looking at the pattern of who generated it." Emily looked at her steadily. She thought about Constance Beaumont. She thought about Walter Greer. She thought about every patient in the last 2 years whose outcome had depended on Emily not stepping back when she was told to step back. "It's done," Emily said. And she meant it, not as absolution, not as a performance of graciousness, but as a simple operational fact. It was done. There was only what came next. Hassan nodded once. She left. Patrice reappeared from wherever she had gone with the speed of someone who had been within earshot the entire time. She looked at Emily with an expression that was trying very hard not to be too much of anything. "The incident report is gone," Emily said. Patrice pressed her lips together. She nodded. And then she did something she had never done in 2 years, which was put both arms around Emily in a brief, fierce embrace that lasted approximately 3 seconds before she stepped back and straightened her scrubs and became professionally composed again. Emily stood there for a moment. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what to do with it. She picked up her chart and went back to work. The next 72 hours were a different kind of exhausting. Federal investigators interviewed her twice. Formal sessions in conference rooms with audio recording and an attorney. Novak had arranged who sat beside Emily and occasionally said nothing because there was nothing to say, because Emily's account was coherent and consistent and documented at every point that documentation existed. She described Vertil's sector with the specificity they needed and the boundaries of what she could confirm versus what she had inferred. And when they pushed at the edges of those boundaries, she held them clearly and without apology, because precision was more useful than accommodation. Gareth Collis was apprehended on the morning of the second day at a truck stop 40 miles south of Kelton in a vehicle registered to a name that didn't match any of the documentation they had on him. He had a phone and a laptop and a significant amount of cash, none of which helped him in any meaningful way. The federal case, as Novak explained in a briefing that was more detailed than Emily had expected to receive, had expanded significantly with the processing of Holt's encrypted drive. The weapons diversion operation had run for 3 years and involved 7 confirmed military and former military actors at varying levels. Terrence Bale, the man who had called the hospital desk and met Emily in the ambulance bay, turned out to be the operational coordinator for the network's domestic logistics. The person who arranged transportation, handled cash distribution, managed the civilian side contacts like Calloway. He had begun cooperating within hours of his arrest, which Novak attributed to the speed with which he recognized that his cooperation was the only asset he had left. Calloway's attorney negotiated his interview terms for 4 days before the process produced anything useful. What eventually emerged was a picture that was both more and less than Emily had expected. He had been approached 16 months ago by a man he described as a former colleague from a continuing education program, a man who turned out to be one of Collis's network contacts. The initial asks had been small. Was there a nurse named Emily Carter at the hospital? Was she stable in her position? Did she have any connections to military or federal contacts that he knew of? Calloway had answered these questions, he said, because they seemed innocuous, because he had told himself they were professional background checks of some kind, because the money that accompanied the questions was enough to be meaningful, but not so large as to seem alarming. When presented with this account, Emily's attorney said nothing. Emily also said nothing because what could be said about a man who had told himself a convenient story for 16 months while methodically documenting her professional life for people who wanted to neutralize her, except that the story had finally met the facts, and the facts were winning. Calloway was charged with obstruction and material support. His attorney indicated he would cooperate fully. The hospital board accepted his resignation by the end of the first week, in a statement that was notable for what it didn't say. There was no defense of his record, no expression of gratitude for his service, just a clean severance and a notification that interim leadership would be announced shortly. Emily read the statement on her phone during a break and felt, not satisfaction exactly, something more complicated, the relief of a pressure releasing, the residual weight of knowing that the pressure had been there for 2 years and she had carried it as a normal condition of her days. She put her phone away and went back to her patients. Marcus Holt's transfer to a secure medical facility went smoothly, or smoothly enough. The receiving team called Harlow County General's ICU with a question about his drain output on the second day, and Patrice, who had taken the call, relayed it to Emily, who was technically off shift but answered it anyway, and gave them the threshold number she'd told Novak to pass along, and which had apparently not been passed along with sufficient specificity. The drain was at 580. She told them to image before pulling. They imaged. There was a small residual pneumothorax that would have been missed if they'd pulled early. They kept the tube another 18 hours and then removed it without complication. She got a text from Novak about it 2 days later. Receiving team wanted me to tell you the drain call was correct. Captain Holt says to tell you he's going to need a better cover story for the chest scar than workplace accident. Emily read the text. She almost smiled. She put the phone down. The federal investigation moved on its own timeline, which was not her timeline, and she learned to exist in parallel with it, providing what was requested when it was requested, answering questions when they came, and otherwise returning her attention to the department and the work. A new ER chief was announced in the second week. An interim, a woman named Dr. Keene, who had transferred from a larger facility upstate and who walked into the department on her first day and asked Emily directly and without preamble to brief her on the clinical culture she was inheriting. Emily spent 45 minutes with her. She was direct. She identified the structural problems she had observed over 2 years, the triage bottlenecks, the communication gaps between attending physicians and nursing staff, the way certain cases had been systematically underprioritized because of intake pressure. She did not editorialize. She presented the pattern and let the pattern speak. Dr. Keene listened to all of it without interrupting. At the end, she said, "What would you have done differently if you'd had the authority?" Emily thought about it for a moment. "I would have done what I did," she said, "just without having to fight for permission first." Keene looked at her with the particular attention of someone filing information in a place they intend to retrieve it. "I'm going to be making staffing recommendations in the next 30 days. I'd like to include you in some of those conversations." Emily said she was available. She meant it. The thing she had not anticipated was the outside world. She had understood, in the abstract, that a federal investigation connected to a regional hospital and involving weapons trafficking and a former military operator and the arrest of multiple individuals would eventually produce some form of public record. What she had not accounted for was the speed or the specific angle the story would take when it escaped the controlled confines of federal process and reached the local media. It started with the Kelton Courier, which ran a piece in the third week framing it as a story about the arrest of a hospital administrator connected to a federal investigation, with Emily's name appearing twice, once as the nurse whose federal contact had triggered the investigation's local dimension, once as the person who had confronted a suspect in the hospital's ambulance bay. Both references were accurate, and both were more than she had wanted in print. By the following day, 2 regional television stations had picked it up. By the day after that, it had reached a wire service. The version that circulated at the wire level was already somewhat distorted. The details of the ambulance bay encounter were compressed into a narrative about a brave nurse who had faced down an armed suspect, which was true in its literal components, and missed the tactical texture of what had actually happened in a way that made Emily uncomfortable. Her phone number, which she had kept off every form of public record for 2 years, was obtained by someone and published in a comment thread, which necessitated changing it. A reporter came to the hospital and asked for an interview, which she declined. 2 reporters came and she declined twice more. Patrice started running interference at the nursing station with a cheerful implacability that Emily found both useful and vaguely touching. She did not read the coverage. She read enough of it to understand its shape, and then she stopped, because the coverage was not the story, and the story was not hers to tell. And the version of her that appeared in wire service reports was a flattened, useful thing that bore a relationship to who she actually was. Actually was the way a shadow bore a relationship to a person. What she could not fully ignore was the response inside the hospital. It changed. Not dramatically, not with any single moment of declaration, but with the slow reorientation of a community that had been operating under a particular set of assumptions and was now recalibrating. The nurses who had watched Calloway dismiss her in the trauma bay and said nothing. Some of them came to her individually over the course of those weeks, in the break room or the corridor or the medication room, and said things that were imprecise and genuine and cost them something to say. She received them the way she received most things that were complicated, without performance, without false ease, letting them be what they were. Afolabi came to her on a Wednesday afternoon and stood at the nursing station with the particular combination of professional composure and visible emotion of someone who had been rehearsing. "In the trauma bay," Afolabi said. "The day Captain Holt came in. I pressed myself against the wall. I didn't say anything." Emily looked at her. "I knew you were right. I'd been reading about tension pneumothorax. I knew the signs matched what you were describing, and I didn't say anything." "You're a 6-week resident," Emily said. "Speaking up against an attending in that setting would have cost you significantly." "That's not—" Afolabi stopped. "That's not a justification. I know it." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to apologize to me," she said, "but remember what that felt like. Knowing the answer and not saying it because of what it might cost you. Remember it, and when you have enough standing in a room that your voice has weight, use it." She held the resident's gaze. "That's all I can tell you." Afolabi nodded. She went back to her patients. Emily watched her go and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not pride exactly, and not satisfaction, but something that had the quality of continuity, of something being passed forward. She turned back to her work. On the 22nd day after Marcus Holt's arrival in the trauma bay, Emily came in for her morning shift and found a sealed envelope on the desk at the nursing station with her name on it, handwritten, the compact, precise script she recognized from the margin of an aerial photograph she had been handed in a hospital hallway. She opened it. Inside was a single page, typed, with a federal letterhead she was not surprised by, and a subject line she was. RE, Personnel Record Review, Carter, EM. Classification status. She read it standing at the nursing station because it wasn't long. It said that a review of her classified personnel file, initiated as part of the federal investigation and completed in the preceding week, had identified a discrepancy in the record as it currently stood. Specifically, a notation made 41 months ago, KIA, confirmed, Special Operations, Air Force, had been reviewed against available documentation and found to be inaccurate. The notation had originated from a report that was itself connected to a document falsification chain associated with the network currently under federal investigation. In short, the record of her death had been manufactured. Not by accident. Not by the fog of an operation gone wrong. It had been entered deliberately into the system by someone with administrative access, as part of a broader effort to remove her as a credible witness to events in Vertil's sector. She had known this was possible. Knowing something is possible and reading its confirmation in federal letterhead were different experiences. She read it again. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and looked at the department around her. The morning intake beginning, the overnight staff finishing their notes, Patrice handing off to the day charge nurse with the compressed efficiency of someone who had been doing handoff for 11 years and had it down to its essential components. Everything looked the same. Everything was different. Her phone buzzed. Novak, I assume you've received the letter. I want to be straightforward with you about something. Emily typed, Go ahead. The review of the falsified KIA notation has surfaced a name. The individual who entered that record into the system 41 months ago. Someone with the access, the timing, and we've now confirmed a connection to the trafficking network that goes back considerably further than any of the other actors we've identified. Emily stood very still. It's not someone from the military administrative system, Novak continued. The access was external. Credential theft, sophisticated, the kind of thing that takes planning and resources and specific knowledge of the system architecture. Who? Emily typed. The response took 40 seconds, which was long for Novak. We don't have a name yet, but we have a location where the access originated, and we have a digital signature that our forensic team says matches another intrusion, one that happened 3 weeks ago. Emily looked at the word. Another intrusion. She typed, Where? Harlow County General's HR system, specifically your current employment file. Someone accessed it from an external terminal 3 weeks ago, before Holt arrived, before any of this started locally. A pause. Carter, whoever manufactured your KIA record 41 months ago has been monitoring you here. They knew where you were before Holt knew, before we knew. Emily read this and then read it again and looked up at the nursing station and the department and the people moving through it and felt the specific quality of a situation that had resolved itself into a new and more complicated shape, not finished, not closed, but rearranged around a fact she had not had before. Someone had killed her on paper 41 months ago. That same someone had found her, in this hospital, in this city, months before a wounded Navy captain bled onto Route 9 and everything began to unravel, which meant they had been watching her long enough to have a plan. And the plan had not included the possibility that Marcus Holt would survive a tension pneumothorax in Harlow County General's trauma bay, or that the woman treating him would be the same woman they had declared dead 4 years ago. Her phone buzzed one more time. We need to meet, today. There's one more name on the drive we haven't been able to place yet. Captain Holt says he thinks you'll recognize it. Emily put her phone in her pocket. She looked at the department. She looked at her patients. She thought about the letter folded against her chest and the notation that had erased her and the person who had put it there and was apparently still watching, still calculating, still out there with a plan she only partially understood. She thought about Novak's message. One more name on the drive. She picked up her chart. She started her rounds. She would meet Novak at the end of her shift, and she would look at the name, and whatever it was, she would deal with it the way she had dealt with everything that had come before it. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but with the particular steady competence of someone who had survived being declared dead and kept working anyway. But the name was not going to be someone she didn't know. She was already certain of that, and the certainty sat in her chest like something with weight and temperature while she moved through the morning shift with the focused forward motion that had always been her best and most reliable instrument. She changed the burn patient's dressing in bed 9. She reviewed the lab results on a 60-year-old woman with suspected sepsis and flagged the lactate trend for Dr. Keene before it became urgent. She answered Afolabi's question about a drug interaction with the same patient she always brought, and she helped a frightened 19-year-old who had come in alone with a dislocated shoulder and no one to call, staying with him through the reduction procedure and talking him through the pain in the steady voice she'd developed over years of talking people through things considerably worse than a dislocated shoulder. She did all of this while the name she hadn't yet seen sat in the edges of her attention like something bright and peripheral, and she did not rush toward it, because rushing had never been her method, and whatever it was had already been true for weeks or months or possibly years, and another 7 hours wasn't going to change its shape. At 3:40, she clocked out. She drove to the north side of Kelton. The operational house had changed in the weeks since she'd first been brought there. More equipment, an additional secure workstation, the whiteboard covered in a network diagram that was considerably more populated than the one she'd glimpsed on her first visit. Novak was there. Decker was there. A man she hadn't met before, older, with the bearing of someone whose institutional seniority expressed itself through stillness rather than display, sat at the corner of the folding table and watched her come through the door with an evaluating quiet that she read immediately as federal and high-ranking. Carter, Novak said. She gestured to the chair across from the table and Emily sat. This is Deputy Director Rourke. He's been overseeing the investigation at the federal level since it expanded 3 weeks ago. Rourke nodded. He didn't offer his hand, and Emily didn't reach across the table. She looked at Novak. "The name," she said. Novak opened the laptop and turned it. On the screen was a scanned document, 1 page, typed, with formatting that Emily recognized as a specific internal military reporting form, the kind used for logistics and inventory reconciliation at the operational level. Midway down the page, in the field marked Authorizing Officer, was a name, Colonel Warren Streck. Emily looked at the name for a moment, then she looked up at Novak. "He was the logistics coordinator for the Verdal sector rotation," Emily said. "He was the officer who filed the loss report on the weapons consignment, the one that attributed the loss to enemy action." "Yes," Novak said. "He signed the report that started the falsified chain, the one that made 3 years of weapons diversion disappear into a legitimate-looking documentation trail." "Yes," Emily looked back at the screen. "He's still active duty." "He was," Rourke said, and it was the first thing he had said since she walked in. His voice was deliberate, each word placed with the care of someone who had spent decades understanding the weight of what they said officially. "He was placed on administrative hold 48 hours ago, pending the outcome of this investigation. As of this morning, federal charges have been formally filed: obstruction, conspiracy, misappropriation of military property, material support. The U.S. Attorney's Office is also examining the falsified KIA notation as a potential separate charge: deliberate manipulation of military records with intent to obstruct a federal witness." Emily was quiet. Warren Streck. She could see his face clearly, the angular face of a man in his early 50s, silver at the temples, the specific efficient courtesy of an officer who had learned to be useful and unobtrusive and had used that particular skill to build a decade of cover for something that had nothing to do with service or country or any of the things the uniform was supposed to represent. She had filed a report after Verdal sector, a verbal report first to her commanding officer about irregularities she had observed during the weapons transition, a discrepancy between the physical inventory she had witnessed and the count on the documentation she'd been handed to sign off. She hadn't been asked to sign off on logistics. She had been present for an entirely different operational reason. But she was there, and she had seen the count, and the count was wrong, and she had said so. 3 weeks later, she was listed as KIA. The mission report had her killed by enemy fire during a reconnaissance element. Her unit had been told she was dead. The people who knew what she was and what she could do had been told she was gone, and the record said she was gone. And for 41 months, that record had stood between her and whatever Streck was protecting, because the most efficient way to neutralize a witness is not to threaten them, but to erase them from the category of people whose testimony has standing. She had rebuilt herself from that erasure into a life in a gray building in Kelton that smelled of antiseptic, and she had been in the process of believing that life was sufficient, and she had been wrong and right about that simultaneously in ways she was only now beginning to fully account for. "Where is he now?" she said. "Federal custody, a secure facility outside the state." Rourke folded his hands on the table. "He was apprehended without incident yesterday morning. His legal representation has already been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding cooperation terms." "He'll cooperate," Emily said. "Almost certainly. Because the people above him in the network, the buyers, the financial layer, they're more valuable than he is, and he knows it, and the only card he has left is what he knows about them." She paused. "How many people in the network have been identified total?" 14 confirmed actors across military, former military, and civilian categories. 9 are currently in federal custody. The remaining 5 are subjects of active warrants. Rourke looked at her steadily. "The investigation has reached a stage where the principal architecture is mapped. What remains is prosecution." Emily absorbed this. She thought about 14 people in 3 years and a weapons consignment that had disappeared into a falsified document trail, and the particular, patient, methodical labor of someone like Marcus Holt, spending 7 months building the documentation to bring it down. She thought about the cost of that labor measured in a bullet wound on Route 9 and a chest tube in an ICU and a piece of paper that declared her dead. "Captain Holt," she said. "Recovering well," Novak said. "He asked to speak with you. When you're ready. No urgency." His words. Emily nodded. She looked at the screen one more time. At Warren Streck's name on a logistics form that had started a chain of falsification that ran for 3 years and 14 people and ended in a gray SUV on Route 9 and a trauma bay in Harlow County General. She looked at it until it was just words, just a name on a document, just the beginning of a legal process that would take time and was already irreversible. "Is there anything else you need from me tonight?" she said. "One thing," Rourke said. He reached into the folder in front of him and withdrew a single document and slid it across the table. "Your signature on the formal witness statement confirming the Verdal sector discrepancy as you observed it." Emily looked at the document. It was 4 pages, the account she had given in the 2 formal interviews rendered into the precise language of federal legal record. She read it. She read it carefully, all 4 pages, because she had learned a long time ago never to sign something you hadn't fully read, regardless of who was asking or what context suggested urgency. The account was accurate. Every detail was accurate. She picked up the pen. She signed it. She slid it back across the table. "Thank you," Rourke said, and the 2 words carried the specific weight of someone who didn't use them casually. She drove home in the dark, and she made dinner, and she ate all of it this time, sitting at the kitchen table in the quiet house, and she didn't turn on the television. The public accounting happened the way these things happen when they finally happen. Not in a single moment, but in a cascade, each piece landing and shifting the landscape for the next. The federal charges against Warren Streck were filed publicly on a Thursday morning, and by noon they were in regional news, and by evening they were national, because a sitting Army colonel charged with a 3-year military weapons diversion operation connected to international arms trafficking was the kind of story that moved. The other actors followed, names released in batches as warrants were served, the shape of the network becoming visible to people who had no framework for it the day before. Emily's name appeared in the coverage on the second day. Not prominently at first, she was referenced as a witness, a former Air Force operator whose classified personnel record had been among those falsified by the network. By the third day, the framing had shifted, the way media framing shifts when journalists start asking the next question. Who was she? What had she seen? Why had her record been altered to show her as dead? The story that emerged in the coverage was incomplete, and in some places inaccurate, and in a few places accidentally closer to the truth than she was entirely comfortable with. And she declined every interview request and let Novak's office handle the communications and kept going to work. It was Patrice who told her about the staff meeting. Dr. Keene had called a full department meeting for the following Tuesday. All ER staff, nursing and physician, which was unusual enough to generate its own speculation in the days before it happened. Emily went because she went to department meetings and because there was nothing to be gained from avoiding it. The meeting room was full. She sat in the middle because sitting at the back would have looked deliberate, and sitting at the front would have looked performative, and the middle was where she always sat. Dr. Keene stood at the front of the room with the specific composure of a leader who had decided on her approach before she walked in and was executing it cleanly. She spoke about the events of the preceding weeks in the direct, unornamented way that Emily had come to associate with her in their early interactions. She addressed Dr. Calloway's role without euphemism, the information he had provided to external actors, the manufactured documentation campaign against a staff member, the formal charges he now faced. She addressed the structural failures in the department's culture that had allowed a pattern of harassment to persist without sufficient scrutiny, and she used the word harassment without qualification, and Emily felt several people in the room shift in the way people shift when accurate language is applied to something they had been calling something softer. Then Dr. Keene said, "I want to recognize something that this department did correctly, even when its institutional structure failed." She looked at Emily. The room looked at Emily. Emily looked back at Dr. Keene. The clinical decisions made in this department over the last 2 years, decisions that were challenged, documented against, used as grounds for disciplinary action, those decisions were correct. Every one that I've been able to review has been correct, and the patients who benefited from those decisions are alive because someone in this room refused to perform helplessness when she didn't feel it. Nobody spoke. "That's not a small thing," Dr. Keene said. In this environment, in any clinical environment, the pressure to stay in designated lanes, to defer when you see something, to wait for permission you shouldn't need, that pressure is real and it has consequences. Sometimes those consequences are a patient who doesn't get the outcome they should have gotten. She paused. I want this department to understand that clinical courage is not insubordination. Knowing something and acting on it is not overreach. The paperwork that tried to make it look like those things was the problem, not the act. She moved on to operational announcements. The meeting ended. People filed out. Afalabi touched Emily's arm on the way past and didn't say anything, just briefly, the way you mark something you don't have the right words for. Emily walked back to the department and picked up her chart and started her afternoon. She visited Marcus Holt on a Saturday, 3 weeks after his transfer to the secure medical facility, which was within driving distance if you were willing to drive 2.5 hours each way on a Saturday, which she was. The facility was a private operation used by federal agencies for protected witnesses and sensitive medical cases, and it looked from the outside like a modest regional hospital, and from the inside like a hospital that had been given considerably more budget for security than for aesthetics. He was sitting up in the bed when she came in. The chest tube was long gone. His color was good. He looked like a man who had been badly damaged and had applied the same methodical discipline to recovering from it that he probably applied to everything else. "You drove 2.5 hours," he said. "I wanted to check the scar," she said. He laughed, which apparently still hurt a little from the way his face adjusted. He showed her the site, healing well, no signs of complication, the suture line clean. She looked at it with the professional attention it deserved, and then she sat in the chair and they were quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they have a great deal to say and aren't sure where the beginning is. "Streck," she said. "I know." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "I found the logistics form about 8 months in. I knew whose name was on it before I knew what the name meant. It took me another 2 months to build the connection back to the record falsification." "When did you figure out about my file?" "About 6 weeks before Route 9. He met her eyes. "I almost came to find you then. I didn't know if you knew. I didn't know if finding you would help or put a target on you faster." He paused. "I made the wrong call." "You made a call," she said, "with incomplete information, under pressure. That's different." He looked at her steadily. "You were listed as dead for 41 months. "I knew I wasn't dead," she said. He blinked. And then the thing that crossed his face was not quite a laugh and not quite grief, but something that lived in the complicated space between the two. The expression of a person who has carried a weight long enough that relief and sorrow have become indistinguishable from each other. "What are you going to do?" he said, "after all this settles?" Emily considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Keep working," she said. "Dr. Keene asked me to be part of the clinical protocol review, triage procedures, nursing scope guidelines, the things that needed changing for a long time. That's not nothing. No, it's not. They offered me a position," he said, "advisory role, working with the investigation team on the remaining network actors." He looked at the window, which showed a rectangular section of sky that was doing nothing in particular. "I'm going to take it, when I can sit upright for more than 4 hours without my ribs reminding me they're still cracked." "Give it another 3 weeks," Emily said. "That's very specific." "Rib fractures at your age and activity level, conservative estimate." She stood. "Don't rush it. The advisory role will wait." "Carter." He said her name with the weight of something that had been carried a long way. "I'm sorry, for all of it. The way it landed on you. The KIA notation, the years of not knowing if anyone was going to find the right thread to pull. I'm sorry it took this long." Emily stood at the bedside and looked at this man who had bled on Route 9 to pull that thread, who had come into her trauma bay and grabbed her wrist and said 2 words that cracked open the life she had built from nothing. And she thought about apologies and what they were worth and what they cost, and whether the accounting between people who had survived the same bad geometry of events ever really balanced. "You pulled the thread," she said. "That's what mattered." She left him there in the white room with the rectangular window and the healing scar, and drove 2.5 hours back to Kelton with the windows down, part of the way because she needed the air, and she needed to think, and she needed, in the specific privacy of a moving vehicle on an empty highway, to let the things she had been holding very carefully for a very long time begin to release. Warren Streck's preliminary hearing was held 38 days after his arrest, in a federal courthouse in the state capital. Emily did not attend. She had provided her testimony in the formal record, and Rourke's office had told her she would be called as a trial witness when the case reached that stage, which would be months away at minimum. She understood this and accepted it and went to work on the morning of the hearing the same way she went to work every morning. She heard about what happened not from Novak but from Patrice, who had been following the news coverage with the thorough attention of someone who had decided that what had happened in their hospital was a thing they were going to understand fully. He entered a plea, Patrice said. She was at the nursing station, phone in hand, reading. Guilty on 4 of the 7 counts. The cooperation agreement is going to require him to testify against the remaining 5 network actors who haven't been apprehended yet. Emily stopped at the station. Which 4 counts? Conspiracy, misappropriation of military property, obstruction of a federal investigation. Patrice looked up. And falsification of military records. That's the one with your name attached to it. Emily was quiet. The U.S. attorney issued a statement, Patrice continued, looking back at her phone. It says the falsification of the personnel record was a deliberate, premeditated act carried out to eliminate a witness whose testimony could have ended the operation 4 years earlier, and that the plea and cooperation agreement do not diminish the severity of that act. She put the phone down. There's a quote from Rourke's office saying the falsified record will be formally corrected in the military personnel system with a notation of the circumstances. Emily looked at the nursing station, at the department beyond it, at the place she had come to when she was trying to disappear and had instead, in the specific roundabout way of things that refused to stay buried, ended up more visible than she had ever intended. Okay, she said. Patrice looked at her. That's all you've got? Okay? What else is there? I don't know. He tried to erase you. He tried to make you not exist. And now he's in federal custody pleading guilty to it. Patrice held her gaze. That seems like it deserves more than okay. Emily thought about it honestly. It's not nothing, she said. It matters. What it does is it means the record says what actually happened instead of what someone needed it to say. It means the version of events that was built to protect him doesn't get to stand as the official account. She paused. That matters a lot to me. It just doesn't look like a lot from the outside. Patrice was quiet for a moment, then, for what it's worth, from the inside it looks like everything. Emily picked up her chart. She went to work. The formal correction of her military personnel record arrived in the mail on a Tuesday, which was unremarkable as days went. A manila envelope from a federal records office. Inside it a single letter and a corrected document. Her file, the relevant pages, with the KIA notation struck and replaced with the accurate account. Record correction pursuant to federal investigation findings. Separation notation amended. Prior record classification reviewed and corrected. She read it at the kitchen table in the house that still had no photographs on the walls and furniture she hadn't chosen with care, and she sat with it for a while. The way you sit with something that you have been waiting for long enough that its arrival produces less joy than you expected and more of something quieter. What she felt was not triumph. Triumph was too clean for what this was. What she felt was closer to the specific exhaustion of a sustained effort finally reaching its endpoint. Not the exhilaration of a finish line, but the release of a held breath, the body recognizing that the work it has been doing in the background, the constant low-level effort of maintaining a constructed life against the pressure of what was underneath it, no longer needed to be done at that intensity. She had been surviving. She had been surviving skillfully and without complaint and with the competence that had always been her most reliable resource. But surviving is not the same as living, and she understood now, in a way that hadn't been fully available to her before, that the distinction mattered. She put the letter on the table and looked at the walls of the house and thought about photographs. 3 days later, Director Hassan called her into the administrative office for a meeting that had been formally scheduled rather than appearing without notice, which was itself new. Emily sat across the desk from Hassan in the chair that had armrests, which the chair in the small office adjacent to the nursing station did not, and waited. I've been in conversation with the board, Hassan said, about the department's structure going forward. Dr. Keene is confirmed as permanent ER chief. She's expressed an interest in establishing a senior clinical coordinator role, a position that sits between the nursing and physician tracks and has formal authority to flag clinical concerns upward without requiring attending physician co-authorization for certain categories of intervention. Emily looked at her. It would involve a scope of practice expansion, a formal credentialing review, and a salary adjustment. It would also mean a formal seat at the department's clinical operations table. Hassan looked at her steadily. Dr. Keene asked me to offer it to you specifically. I concur with that recommendation. Emily sat with this. She thought about the specific things she had done in the last 2 years that had required fighting for permission, the EKGs, the interventions, the clinical flags that had gone through unofficial channels because the official channels were obstructed by someone who had reasons beyond professional disagreement to obstruct them. She thought about doing those things with a formal structure behind them, the interventions becoming procedure rather than exception, the knowledge she carried being treated as the resource it actually was. Yes, she said. I'll take it. Hassan nodded. She extended her hand across the desk and Emily shook it, and the meeting was over in the efficient way of people who have said what needed to be said. Emily walked back to the ER and told Patrice, who reacted with a volume and enthusiasm that drew attention from 3 adjacent beds and had to be actively modulated. Keep it down, Emily said. I am keeping it down. This is me at 30%. Patrice composed herself approximately. This is what should have happened 2 years ago. It's happening now. I know, I'm just saying. Patrice straightened her badge, which had gotten turned around in the general excitement. I'm proud of you for not leaving. After everything Calloway put you through, you could have just gone somewhere else. Started over. A lot of people would have. Emily thought about that. About the specific decision to stay, which had been made originally out of stubbornness and exhaustion and the absence of a clear alternative, and which had turned out to be the right decision for reasons she hadn't understood when she made it. I wasn't going to let him have the department, she said. He had enough. Patrice smiled, a real one, full and unguarded. No, he had too much already. Calloway's hearing was held 6 weeks after Streck's. He had retained a private attorney and fought the obstruction charge harder than the material support charge, which suggested his attorney believed the material support evidence was more solid, which it was. He was ultimately convicted on both counts. The sentencing was set for the following spring. His medical license, which the state licensing board had placed under review concurrent with the federal charges, was suspended pending the outcome of that process. Emily learned about the conviction the same way she learned about most things during that period, through Patrice, who had appointed herself a reliable news relay, and through the brief factual text from Novak that arrived about 20 minutes after the verdict was returned. She was in the middle of a complicated dressing change when her phone buzzed, and she didn't look at it until she was finished and had properly disposed of the materials, because the patient in front of her required the attention she had committed to giving him, and everything else waited. When she did read the messages, she stood at the nursing station for a moment and looked at the department around her. The ordinary afternoon of a regional ER, the sound and motion of a place that kept going regardless of everything that happened inside it and outside it, and to the people who worked within its walls. She thought about Calloway standing in the trauma bay telling her to step back. She thought about 14 months of notes. She thought about the formal incident report that he had hand-delivered to an administrator's desk in a hospital where he was the trusted authority, and the confident expectation that the authority would protect him. She thought about how thoroughly he had misunderstood what authority was for. She put her phone away and went back to work. The thing nobody told you about vindication was that it was mostly quiet. There was no single moment where the record corrected itself in front of a full audience and someone handed you back the years you'd spent in the wrong lane and the patients you'd helped with one hand tied behind your back and the mornings you'd driven to work already calculating how to do your job around the person who was supposed to support it. There was no ceremony for that. There was just the work continuing, in a slightly different shape, with slightly more room in it. The clinical coordinator role formalized what Emily had been doing informally for 2 years, which meant in practice that the work itself changed very little. The conversations did. She was in the room now for protocol discussions. Her assessments entered the official record with her name attached, rather than filtered through a co-signature or reframed as a suggestion. When she saw something, she said it, and the structure of the department received it as information rather than insubordination. That difference, which looked small from outside, was everything from inside. She understood this in her body before she understood it in any articulable way. She also started doing something she had not done in 2 years, which was eating lunch with other people. It had started with Afalabi, who had taken to bringing food that was slightly too much for one person and leaving the extra in a way that made it easy to join without making it an event. Emily had joined 3 times before she noticed she was doing it with something like regularity, and by then it was simply what happened on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, when their schedules overlapped and Afolabi had cooked something the night before. It was small. It was the kind of small thing that doesn't survive at the level of any individual detail and accumulates into something that matters at the level of a life. She had been living at the level of survival for long enough that living at the level of a life required some adjustment. She was adjusting. Novak called on a Wednesday evening in the 6th week after Streck's plea, with a particular tone of finality that Emily had learned to recognize, not the end of the investigation, which would take considerably longer, but the end of the part that required Emily's active presence. "The remaining 4 network actors have been apprehended," Novak said, "all 4 in custody as of this morning. The warrants have been served and the case against the financial layer is being built from the cooperation testimony currently in process." She paused. "Your witness role for the trial is still active, but we're looking at 12 to 18 months before that reaches the stage where your testimony would be presented. You'll hear from the U.S. Attorney's Office when the timeline narrows." "I understand," Emily said. "There's one more thing." Novak paused in a way that was more deliberate than her usual pauses. "The Air Force has reviewed your separation status in light of the record correction. You were medically discharged under the falsified record. The circumstances of your separation as documented were generated by the same falsification chain. They've offered to review that status and potentially restore your discharge classification to honorable with full recognition." Emily was quiet. "You don't have to respond now," Novak said. "It's not a time-sensitive offer." "I know," Emily said. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking." Another pause. "Carter, for what it's worth, from the federal side of this, what you did. Not in the ambulance bay, not with the witness statement. In that trauma bay, on the first day, when you made the call on the pneumothorax without authorization and without any knowledge of what was coming. That call started everything, because Holt survived it." Emily looked at her kitchen wall. The bare wall, still bare, though she had looked at a few photographs in a box she'd found at the back of her closet. "Not ready yet. Soon." "He would have died in 4 minutes," she said. "I wasn't starting anything. I was just doing what was in front of me." "I know," Novak said. "That's exactly what I mean." They said goodbye and Emily put the phone down and sat at the table for a while in the quiet house. And she thought about Warren Streck in federal custody and Calloway awaiting sentencing and the 14 people in the network's architecture being dismantled one by one through the slow machinery of prosecution. She thought about the document in the manila envelope with her name and the corrected notation. She thought about Marcus Holt driving 2.5 hours to give a deposition that he didn't have to give, in a case he could have walked away from when they told him his documentation was sufficient without him. She thought about what it meant to do what was in front of you when what was in front of you cost something, and to do it anyway, not because you were certain of the outcome or certain of yourself, but because the alternative was being someone who knew and said nothing, and she had never been able to make herself into that person no matter how much easier it would have been. She put on her jacket. She drove to the hardware store before it closed, because she had decided something about the walls, and deciding was always the first step, and the first step was where everything began. There was a particular evening, 2 months later, that she would not mark or celebrate but would remember. She was at the end of a shift that had been difficult in the specific medical sense, a pediatric case that had required everything she had, 2 hours of it, and had ended well, which was not guaranteed and was therefore not taken for granted. She was at the nursing station finishing her notes when Afolabi appeared beside her, still in scrubs, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a resident who had been running hard since 6 in the morning. "That was a good call," Afolabi said. "On the kid, the way you flagged the respiratory pattern before the sat dropped." "Thank you," Emily said. She meant it simply. "I've been watching you do that," Afolabi said, "all year. The way you see things before the numbers confirm them. I've been trying to figure out how." She paused. "Is it something you can teach?" Emily finished her note. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You pay attention when you're not sure you need to," she said. "That's most of it. People stop paying attention when the situation seems stable. You don't." She looked at Afolabi, who was 26 years old and exhausted and asking the right questions, which was the only thing you could ask of someone who was still becoming whatever they were going to become. You keep paying attention anyway. The situation will tell you when it's changing, if you're watching. Afolabi absorbed this. She nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone filing something in a place they intend to keep. She said goodnight and walked to the elevator. Emily sat at the nursing station for another moment. Alone in the way that had been her default condition for so long, it had stopped feeling like deprivation and started feeling like orientation, the specific position from which she could see everything that needed seeing. Then she picked up her bag and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood there in the corridor of Harlow County General, which smelled the same as it always had and looked the same as it always had and was, in the ways that mattered most, completely changed. She thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the events. She had turned the events over enough. The cost of it. The specific human cost of being told repeatedly, systematically, by people with authority and by people with malice and by the machinery of a falsified record that she was less than what she was. The cost of absorbing that. The cost of knowing, anyway, in the private certainty of a person who has done the things she had done and cannot be fully convinced she didn't do them, that the assessment was wrong. Most people, when they are told long enough and loudly enough and by enough official-seeming sources that they are not what they know themselves to be, begin to wonder. It is the natural response. It is the human response. Doubt is not weakness. Doubt is what happens to honest people when the pressure is sustained and the documentation is stacked, and the person with authority keeps signing his name to the version of reality that serves him. She had wondered. She would not pretend otherwise. There had been mornings in this hospital when she had stood in the medication room or the stairwell and run the question honestly. Was she wrong? Was the clinical call wrong? Was the intervention too far? Was the instinct she trusted the instinct of someone qualified to trust it? And she had always come back to the same answer, not with arrogance, but with the simple fidelity of someone who will not lie to themselves even when lying would be easier. Yes, I knew. I was right. And being right matters, not for the sake of being right, but because on the other end of every call is a person who needs the right call to be made. Constance Beaumont's NSTEMI, Walter Greer's perforated ulcer, Marcus Holt's collapsing lung, the pediatric case that evening. Every one of them a person. Every one of them the reason for the knowing and the reason to fight for the right to use it. The elevator opened. Emily stepped in. The thing about being underestimated, she understood now, was that it was only permanent if you accepted the estimate. The people who had dismissed her, Calloway with his 14 months of notes and his institutional authority, Streck with a falsified record and a decade of patience, everyone who had looked at the quiet nurse in the worn-out sneakers and seen the ceiling of what she was, none of them had been wrong about what they observed. She was quiet. She was in all the visible ways ordinary. She had spent significant effort on being ordinary. What they had miscalculated was the cost of that effort. What it meant that someone with her background and her capability had built an ordinary life with such intentionality, not because she had nothing left, but because she had chosen to pour what she had into the smallest, most immediate, most human possible scale. One patient, one call, one needle in one chest cavity in one moment when 4 minutes was all the time that was left. That was not diminishment, that was precision. That was a person who understood that the largest things are made entirely of small ones, and had decided to spend her particular skills on the small ones, one at a time, in a gray building in a medium-sized city, for as long as they were needed. She had not stopped being Wraith. She had simply found a different application for what Wraith was. The elevator doors opened onto the ground floor. She walked through the lobby, past the security desk where the overnight guard gave her a nod she returned, past the main entrance with its automatic doors and its view of the parking lot and the dark sky above Kelton, out through the side exit into the cold air that hit her face the way cold air always did, present and immediate and clarifying. She walked to her car. She got in. She drove home to the house that now had 3 photographs on the walls. Small ones, nothing dramatic, faces she had allowed herself to keep visible again after years of deliberate blankness. And she made tea, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she was, in the quiet, ordinary way of someone who has finished a long and necessary fight and is learning what the other side of it feels like, something approaching all right. Not healed, not finished with whatever came next. There would be a trial and a testimony and the long tail of institutional repair and the daily work of a role she was still growing into. Not without the weight of 41 months of a life lived in the aftermath of being officially erased. But present, solid, occupying the specific space she occupied without apology and without the constant background effort of justifying her right to occupy it. The strongest people she had ever known were not the ones who had never been knocked sideways. They were the ones who had been knocked sideways completely, who had felt the full force of it, who had not pretended otherwise, and who had gotten up anyway. Not because it was easy, not because they were certain of the outcome, but because the work in front of them was real, and the people who needed it were real, and the knowing inside them was real, and those three things together were enough. They had always been enough. She had known that, in the marrow of her, long before anyone with a title or a letterhead or a formal record confirmed it. That was the thing they couldn't falsify. That was the thing that had always been hers.